Hello, this is Mike Corelli with the Introduction to United States Government course online. Hey, welcome back. In today's lecture, we begin the third part of 4 parts of our course, what I like to call the institutions. So, in the first quarter of our class, we touched on ideas, right? The background of our system of government, including the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, federalism, and the Bill of Rights. In the second part, we really looked at the electorate, the people, through socialization, interest group activities, campaigns and elections and parties, and ideology. So then in this third part, institutions, we look at Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary. In the fourth and final part, we look at the practical application of what we've learned in this class and the role of the U.S. government in the future, specifically through political economy and the expanse or contraction of globalization. In this class, Congress, as is usual, is recorded before a live classroom. So you have the opportunity as an online student to get the look and feel of sitting in class along with us, hearing your fellow classmates ask questions, and heaven forbid, hearing me attempt to answer them. So class is about to begin. Please grab your cup of coffee and your pen and your piece of paper and have a seat. Let's get started. Thanks for being here today. I'm very excited for our lecture on the United States Congress. Before we dive in, though, I want to introduce the seminar question, which is, how do the institutional and structural characteristics of Congress support or impede the pluralist ideal? So in today's lecture, we're going to introduce the institutional characteristics of Congress, which are those elements that are actually found in the Constitution. The structural elements are going to be those characteristics that have evolved subsequent to the ratification of the Constitution. When we're looking at supporting or impeding the pluralist ideal, we remember that the ideal of pluralism is this vibrant marketplace of ideas that Thomas Jefferson and later Oliver Wendell Holmes described. This is separate from pluralist theory, really, that says that groups and not the electorate actually control the democratic process. The pluralist ideal is the more voices, the better. The greater the conversation, the wider, the broader, the deeper the conversation we can have is the pluralist ideal. So how do the institutional and structural characteristics of Congress support or impede that? Now, as usual, when we get to the end of our lecture today, we will take this seminar question and wrestle it into a thesis statement. And from that thesis statement, as usual, we'll turn it into an outline. And I think you'll find that there's plenty of information in this lecture to give you a really good running start on answering this seminar question. Again, it's one of my favorites. There's a lot of information in this lecture. Please take your time, pause, go for a walk, come back to it. It's a lot to fit in, so bear with me. Now, we're going to start with the idea of founders' intent and going back to the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist response in looking at Congress. Okay, let's go. Founders' intent is fairly well visited in Federalist number 47 and 51. And so I'm going to be going back a little bit to our Federalist paper references tonight. We remember what those are from our Chapter 2 and Ratification of the Constitution lecture. Federalist number 47 is called The Particular Structure of the New Government and the Distribution of Power Among Its Different Parts. Having reviewed the general form of the proposed government and the general mass of power allotted to it, I proceed to examine the particular structure of this government and the distribution of the mass of power among its constituent parts. One of the principal objections inculcated by the more respectable adversaries to the Constitution is its supposed violation of the political maxim that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments ought to be separate and distinct. In the structure of the federal government, no regard, it is said, seems to have been paid to this essential precaution in favor of liberty. The several departments of power are distributed and blended in such a manner as at once to destroy all symmetry and beauty of form, and to expose some of the essential parts of the edifice to the danger of being crushed by the disproportionate weight of the other parts. And so he's citing the anti-federalist claims against this form of government proposed in the Constitution. And so then this is Madison's response. No political truth is certainly of greater intrinsic value or is stamped with the authority of more enlightened patrons of liberty than that on which the objection is founded. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, of many, the few, or whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Were the federal Constitution, therefore, really chargeable with the accumulation of power, or with a mixture of powers having a dangerous tendency to such an accumulation, no further arguments would be necessary to inspire a universal reprobation of the system. I persuade myself, however, that it will be made apparent to everyone that the charge cannot be supported, and that the maxim on which it relies has been totally misconceived and misapplied. In order to form correct ideas on this important subject, it will be proper to investigate the sense in which the preservation of liberty requires that the three great departments of power should be separate and distinct. So Federalist number 47, again, citing Madison's model, the Madisonian model, the separation of powers. Then he continues in 51, talking about checks and balances within those three branches of government. In order to lay a due foundation for the separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential for the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have little agency as possible in the appointment of members of the others. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistracies should be drawn from the same fount of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. Perhaps such a plan of constructing the several departments would be less difficult in practice than it may in contemplation appear. Some difficulties, however, and some additional expense would attend the execution of it. Some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on this principle. First, because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be to select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. Secondly, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring. Again, he's arguing that we need to have three distinct branches of government in Federalist 47. And then in Federalist 51, he's talking about the font of authority that would elect those three distinct branches. How do we obtain three distinct branches except by how those branches are chosen? That's what makes them distinct. Now, there is going to be structural elements that are going to cause them to be distinct, but the primary distinction, the foundational distinction, is who elects these puppies, who puts them in office. He says it would seem reasonable that the people would elect them all independently, so that the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive would have no touching as far as their constituencies are concerned. But what he's saying is, that may work on paper, but it doesn't pencil out. It may look right, but it's not going to be achievable. And here's how. We look at the judges. The judges have specific qualifications. Now, it's not that you don't have qualifications to be a president or to be a legislature. Surely you do. But one thing that is necessary in being a judge is familiarity with the law and with the judicial system and how to define cases and how to adjudicate cases. So the qualifications for being a judge are very specific. So what's more important, how we select a judge or making sure that our judges have the correct qualifications?
And thus we're able to get at the intent of the structure of Congress from the Federalist Papers. Now remember, the Federalists were those who were for the ratification of the Constitution and for this system of government. But as we've said a number of times, there existed another viewpoint, the Anti-Federalists. We remember that it was during the ratification process that the Anti-Federalists forced the issue of a Bill of Rights to be included as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So the Anti-Federalists patriots in their own right, had another idea, another viewpoint. And I think before we get too far into the structure and institutions of Congress, we need to look more fully at what the criticisms of this Congress were with the founding generation. And so I want to introduce Sentinel number 1, one of the Anti-Federalist Papers, dated October of 1787, believed to have been written by Samuel Bryan. So, he says, "I am fearful that the principles of government inculcated in this Constitution and enforced in the numerous essays and paragraphs in the newspapers," here he's referring to the Federalist Papers, "have misled some well-designing members of the late convention. But it will appear in the sequel that the construction of the proposed plan of government is infinitely more extravagant. I have been anxiously expecting that some enlightened patriot would, ere this, have taken up the pen to expose the futility and to counteract the baneful tendency of such principles. Mr. Madison's sine qua non of good government is 3 balancing powers, whose repelling qualities are to produce an equilibrium of interests, and thereby promote the happiness of the whole community. He asserts that the administrators of every government will be actuated by the views of private interest and ambition to the prejudice of the public good, that, therefore, the only effectual method to secure the rights of the people and promote their welfare is to create an opposition of interests between the members of 2 distinct bodies in the exercise of the powers of government, and balanced by those of the third. This hypothesis supposes human wisdom competent to the task of instituting 3 co-equal orders in government and a corresponding weight in the community to enable them, respectively, to exercise their several parts, and whose views and interests should be so distinct as to prevent a coalition of any 2 of them for the destruction of the third. Mr. Madison, although he has traced the constitution of every form of government that ever existed, as far as history affords materials, has not been able to adduce a single instance of such government. He indeed says that the British Constitution is such in theory, but this is rather a confirmation that his principles are correct and not to be reduced to practice. If such an organization of power were practicable, how long would it continue? Not for a day, for there is so great a disparity in the talents, wisdom, and industry of mankind that the scale would presently preponderate to one or to the other body, and with every accession of power the means of further increase would be greatly extended. The state of society in England is much more favorable to such a scheme of government than that of America. There they have a powerful hereditary nobility and real distinctions of rank and interests. But even there, for want of that perfect equality of power and distinction of interests in the 3 orders of government, they exist but in name. The only operative and efficient check upon the conduct of administration is the sense of the people at large. Suppose a government could be formed and supported on such principles, would it answer the great purposes of civil society? If administrators of every government were actuated by views of private interest and ambition, how is the welfare and happiness of the community to be the result of such jarring adverse interests? Therefore, as different orders in government will not produce the good of the whole, we must recur to other principles. I believe it will be found that the form of government which holds those entrusted with power in the greatest responsibility to their constituents the best calculated for free men. A republican or free government can only exist where the body of the people are virtuous, and where property is pretty equally divided. In such a government, the people are the sovereign, and their sense or opinion is the criterion of every public measure. For when this ceases to be the case, the nature of the government is changed, as an aristocracy, monarchy, or despotism will rise on its ruin. The highest responsibility is to be attained in a simple structure of government, for the great body of the people never steadily attend to the operations of government, or for the want of due information are liable to be imposed on. If you complicate the plan by various orders, the people will be perplexed and divided in their sentiments about the sources of abuses or misconduct. Some will impute it to the Senate, others to the House of Representatives, and so on, that the interposition of the people may be rendered imperfect or perhaps wholly abortive. But if, imitating the Constitution of Pennsylvania, you vest all the legislative power in one body of men, and then separating the executive and the judicial, elected for a short period and necessarily excluded by rotation from permanency, i.e. term limits, and guarded from precipitancy and surprise by delays imposed on its proceedings, you will create the most perfect responsibility for then, whatever the people feel a grievance they cannot make the authors, and necessarily excluded by rotation from permanency, that is, term limits, and guarded from precipitancy and surprise by delays imposed on its proceedings, you will create the most perfect responsibility for then, whenever the people feel a grievance they cannot mistake the authors, and will apply the remedy with certainty and effect, discarding them at the next election. This tie of responsibility will obviate all the dangers apprehended from a single legislature, and will the best secure the rights of the people. Having promised this much, I shall now proceed to the examination of the proposed plan of government, and I trust shall make it appear to the meanest capacity that it has none of the essential requisites of a free government, that it is neither founded on those balancing restraining powers recommended by Mr. Adams and attempted in the British Constitution, or possessed of that responsibility to its constituents which, in my opinion, is the only effectual security for the liberties and happiness of the people, but on the contrary, that it is a most daring attempt to establish a despotic aristocracy among free men that the world has ever witnessed. I shall previously consider the extent of the powers intended to be vested in Congress before I examine the construction of the general government. It will not be controverted that the legislative is the highest delegated power in government, and that all others are insubordinate to it. The celebrated Montesquieu establishes it as a maxim that legislation necessarily follows the power of taxation. By Section 8 of the first article of the proposed plan of government, i.e. the Constitution, quote, "The Congress are to have power to lay and collect taxes, duty, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States." Close quote. Now, what can be more comprehensive than these words? Not content, by other sections of this plan, to grant all the executive powers of a confederation and a standing army in time of peace, that grand engine of oppression, and moreover the absolute control over the commerce of the United States and all external objects of revenue, such as unlimited imposts upon imports, etc., they are to be vested with every species of internal taxation, whatever taxes, duties, and excises that they may deem requisite for the general welfare may be imposed on the citizens of these states, levied by the officers of Congress, distributed through every district in America, and the collection would be enforced by the standing army, however grievous or improper that may be. The Congress may construe every purpose for which the state legislatures now lay taxes to be for the general welfare, and thereby seize upon every object of revenue. And thus we hear from Samuel Bryan, writing as Sentinel 1. It's good, though, to get another perspective, and this one is the Federal Farmer of the same time. The person writing under the pseudonym Federal Farmer was Richard Henry Lee. Now, the Federal Farmer suggests, quote, "The essential parts of a free and good government are a full and equal representation of the people in the legislature. A full and equal representation is that which possesses the same interests, feelings, opinions, and views the people themselves would were they all assembled. A fair representation, therefore, should be so regulated that every order of men in the community, according to the common course of elections, can have a share in it, in order to allow professional men, merchants, traders, farmers, mechanics, etc., to bring a just proportion of their best-informed men, respectively, into the legislature. The representation must be considerably numerous. We have about 200 state senators in the United States, and a less number than that of the federal representatives cannot clearly be a full representation of this people in the affairs of internal taxation and police, were there but one legislature for the whole Union. The representation cannot be equal, or the situation of the people proper for one government only, if the extreme parts of the society cannot be represented as fully as the central. It is apparently impracticable that this should be the case in this extensive country. It would be impossible to collect a representation of the parts of the country 500, 600, and 700 miles from the seat of government. So says the Federal Farmer. So we're juxtaposing the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist response to get an idea of founders' intent insofar as the structure of the Congress. And so just to recap very quickly, the Federalists were saying that ambition must be made to counteract ambition by having two houses of the legislature and pitting them one against the other. You use that ambition to protect civil liberties. They suggest that the checks and balances created in the constitutional legislature are sufficient to provide that. They said that this is already a model that's being used in the states. They suggest that Congress is best to affirm judges, creating the third branch, the judiciary, and they argue that representation is fairly distributed. The Anti-Federalists, to recap, are saying that the Federalists are making it too complicated and that people will not know to whom to turn to vex their anger. It suggests that the structure has unchecked power to tax that will eventually muscle out the states, and it argues for term limits. It also argues in this last Federalist Farmer that the legislature, by virtue of its small numbers, is impossible to truly adequately represent the entire breadth of society. So this is the Federalist and Anti-Federalist conversation about the structure of Congress that we're trying to examine. So then what we're looking at are the institutional and structural characteristics of Congress, or what makes them distinct, what makes them Congress. How, if we were to point a Martian to a definition of Congress, where would we even begin? Institutional characteristics are those characteristics that are found in Article 1. Article 1, as we know, the founding generation put into the Constitution, making the legislature the premier branch of government. I argued this in Chapter 2, that the founding generation in the Constitutional Convention, when proposing the Constitution, put the premier body of government first, Article 1, giving it the widest expanse of authority. Remember, we went through it, and it was almost ad nauseum. It was almost to the point of nausea, the degree of detail that the Constitutional Convention went into in creating the powers of Congress. And then we turned to Article 2 and the presidency, and it was suspiciously vague and surprisingly short. And so this shows Article 1 as evidence that the founding generation intended Congress to be the premier branch. We see this in the opening phrase of Article 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States and shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So if the institutional characteristics are those elements about Congress that are in the Constitution, what are they? Well, at least, what are some of them? The terms of office. What about the qualifications for office? Not just for the people in office, for the people electing them. What are the constituencies of the different chambers? What are their enumerated powers? What is the structure of institutional leadership? What are the privileges and immunities granted to the legislature? And are there any unique institutional characteristics to the House, to the lower chamber? Are there any unique characteristics to the Senate, the upper chamber? We know the terms of office are 2 years for the House and 6 years for the Senate. You would think that 6 years for the Senate might just be a good compromise. I mean, you have 2 years for the representatives, 4 years for the president, so let's go ahead and make it 6 years, right? We'll make it even for the senators. Did they do this intentionally? Did they just pull it out of the air? Or was it strategic? You know where I'm going with this, right? So we go then to Federalist number 63, that's called the Senate Continued. It's the second of Federalist Papers arguing about the Senate. And this is Hamilton, and you'll be able to tell the difference in the rhetorical style. Thus far I have considered the circumstances which point out the necessity of a well-constructed Senate only as they relate to the representatives of the people. To a people as little blinded and by prejudice and corrupted by flattery as those whom I address, I shall not scruple to add that such an institution may sometimes be necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. So what's Hamilton doing? First, this is great. I love this. This is vintage Hamilton. It's also blowing smoke at us. He's making us feel that them, not you, them, right? Because surely, as little blinded by prejudice and corrupted by flattery as those whom I address, you guys, we're talking about the other folks out there, right? So the best way to start is to say, you understand better than anybody else what I'm going to say, because that gets your co-optation. Hamilton, gotta love him, right? But then you're right, that we are prone to error. We, the electorate, we, the people, we, the mass public, remember this is Hamilton. Misinformed, apathetic, and not to be trusted with the reins of power. Remember that, Hamilton? This is him. So it's not surprising then that he's cautious of us. He's a little afraid of us. So I shall not scruple to add that such an institution may sometimes be necessary as a defense of the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. As the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought, in all governments, and actually will, in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers, so there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow mediated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. What bitter anguish would not the people of Athens have escaped if their government had contained so provident a safeguard against the tyranny of their own passions? Popular liberty might then have escaped the indelible reproach of decreeing to the same citizens the hemlock on one day and statues on the next. So what is he saying? Why 6 years? Well, when we look at 6 years, we also have to look at the cycles of election. Now, the Senate isn't elected as a block every 6 years. We're electing them 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate gets reelected. And then in 4 years, 2/3 of the Senate can be reelected. And then in 6 years, eventually, the entire Senate can be replaced. So think about majority rule in the chamber and the idea of the supermajority, that's 2/3 of the legislature, right? The 2/3 of the legislature, the supermajority, is what's often necessary to override a presidential veto. If you have a popular passion and some some misrepresentation, maybe some demagogue, somebody who leads by force of personality, or some cataclysmic event captures the imagination of the people, and we want to change our legislature completely, we can wash out the House of Representatives like that. All the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years, so they could be gone. They could be absolutely changed, right? All of the bums out. We can only replace 1/3 of the Senate. So for another 2 years, we will maintain a supermajority of the Senate that existed prior to whatever captured the public imagination. So we're safe for another 2 years, and in 2 years, the public mind, as Hamilton suggests, perhaps can regain its sanity. But, he says, in a free government, popular will should and will eventually overcome its leaders. So if the public passion is still thus in another 2 years, hey, we can replace another 1/3 of the Senate. Now we still have a 1/3 of the Senate that is the original Senate prior to, and that's a balance, but it's beginning to shift. The tide's beginning to shift to the public will. And then in 6 years, we're done. And the entire Senate can be changed. This is an institutional characteristic of Congress, that the Senate is only elected 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and they serve 6-year terms. That's an institutional characteristic because it's in the Constitution. So we're asking again, how do the institutional characteristics of Congress support or impede the pluralist ideal? And so the pluralist ideal is the more voices, the better. So how would you argue, just very quickly, if we take this one as a guinea pig, or as a test bunny, right? How would you argue that this Senate 6-year term and being elected by thirds helps or impedes the pluralist ideal? We're playing right into my paws here. So the next one is the qualifications of office. And so the representatives must be at least 25 years of age, have been a citizen for 7 years, and be a resident of the state, although not necessarily of the district from which he or she is chosen. And this is Article 1, Section 2. A senator must be at least 30 years old, have been a citizen for 9 years, and be a resident of his or her state. So let's start with the qualifications for office for the lower chamber. Now, I have a brick to throw at you, though. The qualifications not only for the people seeking office, but for the people electing them into office. Nowhere in the Constitution prior to the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, do we see the franchise listed. The franchise being qualifications to vote. Those were given to the state, right, which is one of the reasons the Civil War forced the issue. And the Constitution needed to be amended to allow free black men over the age of 21 to vote. This is Federalist number 52. So the first view to be taken of this part of government relates to the qualifications of the electors and the elected. Those of the former are to be the same with those of the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. The former being the qualifications of the electors are the same as those of the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. So what they're going to say is, we're not going to establish the franchise in the Constitution. What they're going to say is, whatever the state's rules are for enfranchisement for your most numerous branch of your state legislature, your lower chamber, whatever your state qualifications are to allow your state citizens to vote for your state legislature, that's ours. That's our qualifications. You see? So the Constitution didn't establish the qualifications for you to vote for the House of Representatives. The Senate being elected by the state legislatures, the President being elected by the Electoral College. The House of Representatives was the only branch that was elected directly by the people. And so it's establishing those state legislative qualifications as the qualifications for federal office. There's a reason for this. The definition of the right of suffrage is very justly regarded as a fundamental article of Republican government. It was incumbent on the convention, therefore, to define and establish this right in the Constitution. To have left it open for the occasional regulation of Congress would have been improper for the reason just mentioned. To have submitted it to the legislative discretion of the states would have been improper for the same reason, and for the additional reason that it would have rendered too dependent on the state governments that branch of federal government which ought to be dependent on the people alone. To have reduced the different qualifications in the different states to one uniform rule would probably have been as dissatisfactory to some of the states as it would have been difficult to the convention. The provision made by the convention appears, therefore, to be the best that lay within their option. It must be satisfactory to every state because it is conformable to the standard already established, or which may be established by the state itself. The state can't argue against its own voter qualifications. If the state says you are qualified to vote for the state legislature, how can they say, but you're not qualified to vote for the federal legislature? And so no state can argue against this. Had the federal government tried to establish a uniform rule across all the states, several states would have had a conniption. But they're saying, no, it's your own qualifications. So if you don't like your qualifications, change them. Because it says whatever is established or may be established. So if the state changes its qualifications, that's fine. It's fine. And then the qualifications for voting for the lower chamber are changed as well. It will be safe to the United States because being fixed by the state constitutions, it is not alterable by the state governments and cannot be feared that the people of the states will alter this part of their constitutions in such a manner as to abridge the rights secured to them by the federal constitution. So the state constitution that defines voter qualifications, a constitution is created by the people, not by the state legislatures. So the state legislature can't come down and say, we're going to restrict voting rights in the Constitution. The state legislature can't change the state constitution. The Constitution is the social contract. It has to be approved by the people who are serving under it, who are living under it. We covered this, right? The social contract, codification of the social will. So this voter qualification then is immune from tampering by the state legislatures. It's kind of a locked-in mechanism. Only the people can change, and they're not going to change their voter qualifications. They're not going to take away their own franchise. They may need to expand it to include others, but they're not going to take it away. So the qualifications of the elected, now these are the people who are actually holding office, being less carefully and properly defined by the state constitutions, and being at the same time more susceptible of uniformity, have been very properly considered and regulated by the convention. A representative of the United States must be of the age of 25 years, have been 7 years a citizen of the United States, must at the time of his election be an inhabitant of the state he is to represent, and during the time of his service must be in no other office of the United States. Under these reasonable limitations, the door of this part of the federal government is open to merit of every description, whether native or adopted, young or old, without regard to poverty or wealth, or to any religious profession of faith. Right? So there's no religious test. There's no property test. There's no other test that can keep somebody from office. So they're opening the door. They're trying to broaden diversity of people who would serve in the lower chamber by allowing it as broad as possible. You with me? So that's Federalist number 52. So we're talking there about the lower chamber. Now let's talk about the qualifications for the upper chamber. The qualifications, they say in Federalist number 62, the Senate, the qualifications proposed for senator as distinguished from those of representatives consist in a more advanced age and a longer period of citizenship. A senator must be 30 years of age at least, a representative 25. And the former must have been a citizen for 9 years, as 7 years required for the latter. The propriety of these distinctions is explained by the nature of the senatorial trust, which, requiring greater extent of information and stability of character, requires at the same time that the senator should have reached a period of life most likely to supply those advantages, and which, participating immediately in transactions with foreign nations, and we'll talk about this in a second, ought to be exercised by none who are not thoroughly weaned from the prepossessions and habits incident to foreign birth and education. The term of 9 years appears to be a prudent mediocrity between a total exclusion of adopted citizens, as they do with the presidency, whose merits and talents may claim a share of the public confidence, as an indiscriminate and hasty admission of them which might create a channel for foreign influence on the national councils. It is equally unnecessary to dilate on the appointment of senators by the state legislatures. Among the various modes which might have been devised for constituting this branch of the government, that which has been proposed by the convention is probably the most congenial with public opinion. It is recommended by the double advantage of favoring a select appointment and of giving to the state government such an agency in the formation of the federal government as must secure the authority of the former and may form a convenient link between the two systems. Blah, blah, blah. Remember Federalism, Chapter 3? And I said, please, please, please don't forget the states in the Madisonian model. And I kept hammering that. Remember the role of the states? Here it is again. So the Senate then isn't elected directly by the people. They're elected originally by the state legislatures. And so it's a link between the state legislatures, the state governments, and the federal government. The Senate is elected by the state legislatures. The representatives are elected by the people. The president is elected by the Electoral College. The justices are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So that balance within the three branches is trying to be struck. Constituencies. Constituency is a $10 word that means your constituents, right? Or those people who elected you into office and who you serve. And so if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat, if you've been elected to office, do you only represent Democrats? Do you only represent Republicans? Of course not, right? You represent your entire constituency or those people who you serve. And so we have here a map, govtrack.us, of the different representative districts in California. And what you're looking at then in Napa is the 5th Congressional District. And so you and I share a representative. And so coming back out, that 5th District then is unequal in geography to this bad boy, right? So this is the 2nd District. And look how large that is. That goes all the way up to the Oregon border. It's not based on geography. We know this, right? The House of Representatives is based on proportional representation. So there are a number of noses in the district, the number of people, constituents in the district. But then when we go down to Los Angeles, check this stuff out. Because Los Angeles is so densely populated, the districts are almost by street. Right? And so the districts then of the lower chamber, the representative districts are the constituencies of those representatives. So coming back to us with the 5th District, our representative then, we are his constituents. And I'm living in Santa Rosa, you guys living in Napa, regardless, we're his constituents. Check? Now, the entire state is the constituency of our senators. We have 2 senators, right? Both elected by statewide election. And so the constituencies are the entire state of California. Now, again, not to put a fine point on this, but constituencies are institutional characteristics. They are created, they are crafted in the Constitution.
However, that being said, how the districts are crafted and how the lines are drawn can be a very politicized event. And gerrymandering, that we'll talk about under our institutional characteristics, can be a highly politicized event and result from the structural characteristic of the representative districts existing.
The Connecticut Compromise, right? The Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and the Connecticut Compromise that we touched on in Chapter 2. And many of you did quite well in identifying in your in-class midterm. This is the institutional characteristic. This is why it's important. And so we think again, does it impede or help the pluralist ideal? Right? When you're looking at creating a constituency that's based on numbers of people and not on geographic regions, as it's true, or it was true in the parliamentary system in England, you have, even though a large geographic area, a similar population to a smaller geographic area. So definitely an institutional characteristic. How we form them, why we came to the conclusion of proportionate representation, the Connecticut Compromise, is an institutional characteristic. And it's intended to bolster pluralist theory. It's intended to bolster the idea of more voices the better. Equal representation would even out the voices channeled through one member of the House of Representatives. The enumerated powers are an institutional characteristic. Obviously, they're in the Constitution. So the first 17 clauses of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution specifies most of the enumerated powers of Congress. And beyond these specific powers, as we know, is the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause. Remember, we said the loophole through which you can drive a Mack truck, right? And it allowed the power of the national government, especially of the legislature.
Now, I don't want to brush over enumerated powers too quickly. We understand their position in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. But if we're looking at the characteristics with an eye toward pluralism, then how do these enumerated powers add to or detract from pluralism? Well, I would argue that the U.S. Constitution, as we know it, establishes a system of dual sovereignty, right, that we touched on in Chapter 3, between the states and the federal government, and each state having its own government endowed with all the functions essential to separate and independent existence. So, although the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution designates the laws of the United States as the supreme law of the land, other provisions of the Constitution, as well as legal principles undergirding those provisions, nonetheless prohibit the national government from enacting certain types of laws that impinge upon state sovereignty. The various principles that delineate the proper boundaries between the powers of the federal and state governments, as we know it, are collectively known as federalism. And so federalism-based restrictions that the Constitution imposes on the national government's ability to enact legislation may inform Congress's work in any number of areas of law in which the states and the federal government dually operate. So there are two central ways in which the Constitution imposes these federalism-based limitations on Congress's power. So first, Congress's powers are restricted by and to the terms of express grants of power in the Constitution, which thereby establish internal constraints on the federal government's authority. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress a limited set of carefully defined enumerated powers while reserving most other legislative powers to the states. As a result, Congress may not enact any legislation that exceeds the scope of its limited enumerated powers. That said, Congress's enumerated powers nevertheless do authorize the federal government to enact legislation that may significantly influence the scope of power exercised by the states. For instance, subject to certain restrictions, Congress may utilize its taxing and spending power to encourage states to undertake certain types of actions that Congress might otherwise lack the constitutional authority to undertake on its own, such as No Child Left Behind that we talked about earlier. Similarly, the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution's Commerce Clause to afford Congress substantial, but not unlimited, authority to regulate certain purely intrastate economic activities that substantially affect interstate commerce in the aggregate. Congress may also enact certain types of legislation in order to implement international treaties. Additionally, pursuant to a collection of constitutional amendments ratified shortly after the Civil War, Congress may directly regulate the states in limited respects in order to prevent states from depriving citizens of certain procedural and substantive rights. Finally, the necessary and proper clause, right, that clause that I said we can drive an aircraft carrier through, augments Congress's enumerated power by empowering the federal government to enact laws that are necessary and proper to exercise its express powers. So, in addition to the internal constraints on Congress's authority,
The Constitution also imposes external limitations on Congress's power vis-a-vis the states. That is, affirmative prohibitions on certain types of federal actions found elsewhere in the text or structure of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has recognized, for instance, that the national government may not commandeer the state's authority for its own purposes by forcing a state legislature or executive to implement federal commands, nor may Congress apply undue pressure to coerce states into taking actions that they otherwise are disinclined to take. Furthermore, the principle of state sovereign immunity, which limits the circumstances in which a state may be forced to defend itself against a lawsuit against its will, imposes significant constraints on Congress's ability to subject states to suit. Finally, the Supreme Court has recognized limits to the extent to which Congress may subject some states to more onerous regulatory burdens than other states. And so if you're looking at the balance of pluralism in the characteristics, the enumerated powers given to Congress, as we suggested in Chapter 2, give Congress a lot of authority, a lot of power. But the federal system that we talked about in Chapter 3 disperses that power, diffuses that power, and we know that with diffuse power comes, dare I say it, pluralism. Our next structural characteristic is leadership in both chambers.
And we do have two leaders called out in the Constitution. So everything else is going to be structural, but the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate are two leadership positions that are enumerated in the Constitution. The Speaker is the presiding officer in the House. So in this capacity, the Speaker is empowered to administer the proceedings of the House floor, including the power to recognize members on the floor to speak or make motions, and the power to appoint members to conference committees. The Speaker of the House also serves not only as the titular or titled head of the House, leader of the House, but is also considered the leader of the majority party conference. That role as leader of the majority party conference isn't an institutional characteristic. Parties didn't exist when the Constitution was ratified. And so, as the Republican head of the House, is a structural characteristic that developed subsequent to the Constitution's ratification. A third role of the Speaker we can't forget is that he's just another elected member of the House. He is just a representative. Although elected as an officer, the Speaker continues to be a member as well and has a responsibility to his constituents. Speaker of the House as an institutional characteristic. The other institutional leadership position is the President of the Senate. Now, the Vice President of the United States serves as the President of the Senate.
This used to be a rather difficult concept to get across, but anybody who's lived through the Electoral College vote count with Vice President Pence and President Trump should be well aware now of the Vice President's role as President of the Senate.
We're going to see that there is a President pro tem, and there's going to be a majority leader and a minority leader in the Senate, but the leader of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. Going back to institutional characteristics, helping or impeding the pluralist ideal, why do we care? Well, think about it for a minute. If you have the Senate, and the Senate could be argued is the natural aristocracy in the legislature. What do I mean by that? In the English parliamentary system, you have the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and then you have the monarch, the king. Are we so thinking to believe that we don't have a natural aristocracy in the United States? A natural group of people, an elite, who might rise to levels of prominence by virtue of money, education, race, privilege, class, whatever. It can be argued then that we do have a natural aristocracy. How might this be argued? What does it take to be elected with the entire state as your constituency? Sure, it's hard to be elected a member of the House of Representatives from the 5th District or the 1st District. I'm not arguing that it's not. It takes good political savvy. It takes a good, strong campaign mechanism. It takes good, strong leadership skills, organization, party identification, you name it. But
Being elected representative of a congressional district is nothing like being elected from an entire state. Consider the pluralists and consider the number of people in a constituency at the lower level, at the representative level. You might have some heterogeneity in thought, but really we're more alike than not. But then look at the state, and look at the North Coast versus Orange County. Look at the Gold Coast versus Inland Empire. Look at San Diego versus LA versus San Francisco versus Sacramento. Significantly different constituencies. In order to be elected to represent the entire state, you have to get enough oomph. You have to get enough majority in your vote to capture the imagination of a very broad demographic. In order to do that, you're going to need what a representative needs times 10. Or in our case, times 53. Right? You're going to have to capture the entire imagination of the state. If we can say that there is a natural aristocracy, and that's evidenced by their being able to have the organization necessary to take an entire state, these are the people you want to watch. If you're afraid of an elite consensus, or if you want to watch the elite consensus in the United States, what better way than to put them all in one room, all 100 of them, 2 from every state? And how do you balance them specifically? They have very powerful political ties, senators. They're very powerful. They're very politically savvy. They're very effective. They capture the public imagination. Who are you going to naturally pit them against? Not necessarily the House. You know, we tend to think that it's the House balanced against the Senate. It's more the Senate balanced against the natural monarch, the king. Or, in our case, the executive. And we're not talking about lords. We're not talking about the House of Lords or a true aristocracy, nor are we talking about a monarchy. We're talking about the Republican version of that. Let's say the elite versus the executive. So we pit them against each other. These are going to be institutional characteristics when we talk about those powers given specifically to the Senate to confirm presidential appointments. Why is it that the Senate confirms a judicial appointment by the president and not the House? Why is it that the Senate approves presidential treaties and not the House? We're pitting the Senate against the president. Now, how do we pit the president against the Senate? You put the vice president in charge of the Senate. For example, under John Adams, we had Thomas Jefferson as vice president. As I mentioned in the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson was actively working against his president in his role as president of the Senate, using that role, using that platform to mount his own political campaign. So it's fraught. You can see how this might be fraught. But again, we're looking at institutional characteristics, those characteristics in the institution of Congress that support or impede, that help or impede the pluralist ideal. So how does this help the pluralist ideal? You have to really compromise. You really have to reach out and strike a compromise between the presidency and the Senate in order to get anything done. Another element of the vice president is that he can only vote in the event of a tie. But in a consistently even chamber, there's 2 senators from every state. It's always going to be an even number. And with the close party affiliation that we see, especially today, having a 50-50 vote, having a tie vote, and having the vice president come in to break that vote is the president's voice in the Senate. Again, this is an institutional characteristic. There are elements, institutional characteristics, that are unique to the House, to the lower chamber. For instance, Founders' intent found that the House, with the greater numbers and being more immediately accountable by having shorter terms of office, was seen as the more appropriate venue to address taxation. And so all revenue bills have to originate in the House. What does this mean? Taxes. Revenue bills means that we need to raise taxes in order to pay for government. Revenue bills have to generate in the House, in the lower chamber. They can't be begun in the Senate. Where we know about the IRS, we know about income tax, we know about property tax, we know this way the system works now. Think of how the system worked then. If we were going to impose a tax, you would know about it. Because your representative is a local. Your representative is somebody you know, right? And the idea is that they wouldn't institute a tax without a really good ear to public opinion, because if it's unpopular, they'll be out of office in 2 years. That's the political side, and it's easy to pick on politics. There might be a more elegant reason for the founding generation to have vested the revenue bills in the lower chamber. This is Federalist number 56. It is a sound and important principle that the representative ought to be acquainted with the interests and circumstances of his constituents. But this principle can be further extended no further than to those circumstances and interests to which the authority and care of the representative relate. An ignorance of a variety of minute and particular objects, which do not lie within the compass of legislation, is consistent with every attribute necessary to a due performance of the legislative trust. In order to be a good legislature, you need to not only know how to make good law, you need to have a much broader worldview. You need to have a minute understanding of your constituency and what's going on in your district. So not just making law, but really, really representing the people who elected you to office. In determining the extent of information required in the exercise of a particular authority, recourse then must be had to the objects within the purview of that authority. What are to be the objects of federal legislation? Those which are of most importance and which seem most to require local knowledge are commerce, taxation, and the militia. A proper regulation of commerce requires much information, as has been remarked elsewhere. But as far as this information relates to the laws and the local situation of each individual state, very few representatives would be sufficient vehicles of it to the federal councils. Taxation will consist, in a great measure, of duties which will be involved in the regulation of commerce. So far, the preceding remark is applicable to this object. As far as it may consist of internal collections, a more diffusive knowledge of the circumstances of the state must be necessary. But will this not also be possessed in sufficient degree by a very few intelligent men, diffusively elected within the state? Divide the largest state into 10 or 12 districts, and it will be found that there will be no particular local interests in either, but which will not be within the knowledge of the representative of the district. So you take a large state and you divide the puppy into 10 or 12 representative districts. What they're saying is, because that's a smaller district, the person representing that district will have a minute understanding of what's going on in that district. And so if you're going to impose a tax, if you're going to create a revenue bill, and you're a legislator and you're sitting there in the chambers of commerce thinking, should I vote for this bill or not? You're not thinking just about the bill. According to Federalist number 56, you're thinking about your constituents in a very minute, personal way. Can my constituents afford this tax? What are the elements in our local economy right now? What are the circumstances of commerce? Are we going through a tough time? We might need this revenue bill. We may need this tax, but I need to first bear in mind my constituents. The larger my constituency, the less likely I am to know your particular needs and your particular circumstances. The smaller the district, the more intimately involved I am, the more intimately aware I am of your particular needs, the more likely I am to truly represent you and to create legislation that serves you and doesn't harm you, especially with revenue bills. Remember taxation without representation? They were serious. So they lodged revenue bills in the most populous, the most accountable, the most minutely familiar with their constituency. Those institutional characteristics that are unique to the Senate include, as I suggest, the confirmation of appointments and the ratification of treaties. Federalist number 56, the powers of the Senate continued, argues a well-constituted court for the trial of impeachments is an object not more to be desired than difficult to be obtained in a government wholly elective. The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or, in other words, from the abuse or violation of the public trust. They are of a nature which may, with particular propriety, be denounced as political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The prosecution of them, for this reason, will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community and divided into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In many cases, it will connect itself to the pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or the other, and in such cases there will always be the greatest danger that the decision to impeach, the decision to remove somebody from office, that's an enumerated power of the Senate, an institutional characteristic of the Senate in particular, will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt.
I believe President Trump's first and second impeachments are testament to this fact.
The power of making treaties is an important one, especially as it relates to war, peace, and commerce, and should not be delegated, but in such a mode and with such precautions as will afford the highest security that will be exercised by men the best qualified for the purpose, and in the manner most conducive to the public good. So we're talking about the ratification of treaties. The President proposes a treaty and gives it to the Senate to ratify or to approve. All right, so the President is being checked, in this instance, by the Senate, by the upper chamber. The Convention appears to have been attentive to both these points. They have directed the President to be chosen by select bodies of electors, we'll talk about that next week, to be deputed by the people for that express purpose, and they have committed the appointment of senators to the state legislatures. This mode has, in such cases, vastly the advantage of elections by the people in their collective capacity, where the activity of party zeal, taking the advantage of supineness, the ignorance and the hopes and the fears of the unwary and the interested, often places men in office by the votes of a small proportion of the electors. By choosing the state legislatures to elect the senators, and so by being elected by the state legislatures means that I am doubly qualified, I am doubly thought of, I'm the elect of the elect. And it's only that capacity then, that senator, that special qualification that would put them in a place to balance the president. So to recap, the institutional characteristics: terms of office, check. Qualifications for office, check. Constituencies, the enumerated powers, institutional leadership, those institutional characteristics that are unique to the House, i.e. revenue bills, and those institutional characteristics that are unique to the Senate, i.e. impeachment and or confirmation of appointments. They're two sides of one coin. And the ratification of treaties.
And so what we're looking at then is, in this instance, founders' intent. Now, I made the point when we introduced this entire course, actually in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, that founders' intent provides a good bead on what the Constitution was meant to be. But we know that the Constitution isn't inflexible. It can be amended and it can be interpreted. And so founders' intent is important as far as it goes. In the next section, we're going to be looking at the structural characteristics, how these institutional characteristics allowed Congress to evolve and to change. But before we go off on that tangent, let's just take a breath again and think about founders' intent. Right? In thinking about the reach of congressional power, especially as it relates to pluralism and the pluralist ideal. As about most constitutional questions, really the starting point lies in the constitutional text and its historical purposes. But the historical purposes of the Congress are really hard to reconstruct in a neutral way, because the framers and the ratifiers inhabited a political, economic, and intellectual world so vastly different than ours. Right? We made that point in the Declaration of Independence lecture. On the one hand, the framers clearly anticipated that the states, and not Congress, would be the principal lawmakers. They also appeared to contemplate that the states would retain what they called police power, probably to the exclusion of Congress, to enact legislation
to protect public health, safety, and morals. On the other hand, the framers viewed the Constitution as empowering Congress through these institutional characteristics to deal with all matters of genuinely national dimension. Well, formidable intellectual puzzles arise in the effort to integrate the various elements of the framers' view and to discern their relevance to our modern problems today. To be slightly more concrete, today there are many problems that appear genuinely national in scope that the framers could have never anticipated. Some, such as interstate trafficking in child pornography, may involve threats to the public safety and morals that, as categorized, the framers might have thought the exclusive concern of the states. But suppose that Congress attempts to address the problem, which centrally involves the abuse of children, by forbidding the shipment of child pornography across state lines. Legislation of this form arguably regulates commerce, or trade among the several states in the most literal sense, even if its purpose involves considerations of safety and morality that the framers might have expected to be the province of state rather than federal regulation. An additional element of the framers' worldview further complicates the picture insofar as their expectations occupy center stage. The founding generation regarded each of the states as sovereign, which had retained its sovereignty even after the ratification of the Constitution. We made that vitally important point in chapters 2 and 3. To the 18th century mind, sovereignty implied supremacy. Reconciliation of state sovereignty with national sovereignty thus would appear to have required that there would be no overlap of state and national powers. If the federal government could regulate the same conduct as a state, and thereby displace state legislation, this would have implied that the state was not really sovereign or supreme within its constitutional mandate. Operating within this categorical scheme, at least many members of the founding generation appear to have assumed that there was a distinction between, let's say, the manufacture of products, which was subject only to state and not to congressional regulation, and the shipment and sale of goods in interstate commerce, which did come within Congress's commerce power. But suppose that a manufacturing plant spews pollution into the atmosphere, that the pollution flows across state lines, and that it dangers agriculture, health, and thus the economic productivity in other states. Should Congress be deemed powerless to enact regulatory legislation because of an anachronistic 18th century understanding that the regulation of manufacturing is a power reserved to the states? Isn't pollution genuinely a national problem today, even if it wasn't in 1787? And didn't the framers and ratifiers intend to empower Congress to deal with all genuinely national problems? Well, all modern lawyers and judges struggle with questions such as these. More is at stake than abstract issues of fidelity to the Constitution's original understanding or founders' intent. On the whole, political progressives tend to favor a broad interpretation of Congress's commerce power. Progressives generally support environmental, economic, and workplace safety regulation. Progressives also emphasize that for regulation of this kind to be effective, and sometimes even possible, it must occur at the national level. For example, it may be impossible for any one state to protect its environment effectively if air pollution from other states comes sweeping across its borders. It may be also equally impossible for one state to require employers to provide pensions or medical benefits to their employees if surrounding states do not do likewise. If a single state were to impose such obligations, businesses would just flee to other states where the costs of doing business would be lower. This being so, no state might dare to be the first to mandate that employers provide health insurance to their full-time workers, even if a majority of the voters in all or nearly all states would wish to see such a mandate. In a case such as this, national legislation may be the only kind that is practically and politically feasible. So, whereas progressives tend to favor broad congressional power, conservatives, characteristically, regard it with more skepticism, and not just because they have different views about the nature or significance of the Constitution's original understanding. Part of their opposition reflects resistance to one-size-fits-all national legislation coming out of Congress. In at least some cases, state and local governments may enjoy distinctive advantages in tailoring legislation to local problems and values. Conservatives also tend to believe that government is best which governs least, at least in the area of, let's say, business regulation. Recognition of sweeping federal regulatory power from Congress increases the likelihood that regulation will be enacted at some level of government. So, according to conservatives, regulation not only diminishes liberty, but also threatens to create costly economic inefficiency. As in other cases of constitutional law, it could be argued, of course, that these progressive and conservative views should be irrelevant to matters of interpretation. But for judges needing to decide which strand of the original understanding or founder's intent to emphasize, and how to construe relatively vague congressional. And so all this to say that we bear in mind that founders' intent as reflected in the institutional characteristics of Congress, the terms of office, qualifications, constituencies, enumerated powers, leadership, the unique to the House, the unique to the Senate, all these create a sum total of founders' intent vis-a-vis pluralism, right? We're talking about pluralism in the representative model as described by the Federalists, as decried by the Anti-Federalists, and pluralism, the more voices the better, and the pluralist ideal, this vibrant marketplace of ideas. How is the marketplace fostered and furthered by the institutional characteristics? How are voices shut down and stymied and stopped by the institutional characteristics? That is what we're after here.
What we're looking at now are the structural characteristics of Congress. So the institutional characteristics are those that are in the Constitution. The structural characteristics are those elements about Congress that evolved subsequent to the ratification. Now, some of the structural characteristics may rise from institutional characteristics, but they're distinct or separate enough to call out as such. So, we start then with styles of leadership. The leadership structure, with the exception of the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, which you know are institutional. We're going to look at party caucuses. We're going to look at seniority, committees, unique procedures to the House and to the Senate. We're going to look at incumbent advantage, compensation, reapportionment, redistricting, and gerrymandering in the House specifically. And we're going to look at the legislative process, and time permitting, we'll look at support structures. So we look at styles of leadership. So just very quickly, nowhere in the Constitution do you see a job description. You're elected to the House of Representatives. You're elected to the Senate. What does that mean? You sit down at your desk. What do you do? Right? There is no job description. There is nothing to direct you. Or, in other words, you're on your own to develop your own style of leadership. I would argue that inherently there are four styles of leadership evidenced in the Congress. One is trustee, delegate, partisan, and Politico. So just very quickly, let me go down these. So a trustee then is somebody who feels that they're elected to be the best representative they can be, or the best senator they can be,
and that they get to determine what that is, that we're entrusting them to lead us. So I give you Dianne Feinstein as an example of a trustee. Dianne Feinstein is our senior senator from the state of California, and she gives evidence of being a trustee by her voting against public opinion in California. So you may remember in 1992, we had a fairly serious recession, and one of the elements that came out, especially in Bill Clinton's administration, was to reduce the size of the military. Now, I know this is probably predating a lot of people. That's okay. So we looked about the nation, and we looked at closing bases. We looked at closing air bases, naval bases, army bases. And California was particularly hit because, especially in World War II, with the building of the infrastructure for the military, California was a big jumping off place for the war in the Pacific. I give you NAS Mare Island. I give you NAS Alameda. I give you the Presidio, NAS Long Beach. All these naval air stations then that were created for World War II, and by the time the 1980s and 1990s rolled around, they were seen as fairly well redundant. They weren't needed, they weren't necessary. Now, Dianne Feinstein, being a senator from the state of California, on the Armed Services Committee, you would expect the last thing she would do would be to vote for base closures in California. I mean, listen, we're talking jobs. We're talking a hit to the economy, right? And yet, she sees herself as a trustee. And again, this is evidenced by her voting patterns. She voted to close bases in California. She voted to close Mare Island. She voted to close Alameda, to close the Presidio. Now, in fairness, she also voted for those programs that try to create a public-private partnership, like we see in the Presidio, right, where corporations came in and took over some of the buildings and was able to build up the infrastructure, build up the economy so that the hit of the job loss wouldn't be overly drastic, that there was still federal funding to help in the transition. That was, in large part, Dianne Feinstein's doing. Nevertheless, she voted to close bases in California. Oh, the hue and cry. The hue and cry. You would think that she was, Satan incarnate, right? And she kind of was, for closing bases in California. But remember, we have a 6-year term. And the public imagination and the public ire, especially when there's a good federal program to help build infrastructure following the base closure, can be mitigated. And so she survived that challenge. And boy, this is a trustee, right? Somebody who says, no, you voted for me to have the big picture, to be the best leader I can be, and I see this as my job, and to take the heat. I get that it's going to be hard, but I'm looking at the big picture, just to paraphrase. That's a trustee. Another leadership style is a delegate. Now, this is the exact opposite, and fortunately, our other senator, her job then is to carry her constituents' voice forward. She's a delegate. Another model is a partisan model. Now, we don't have one of those in our delegation, but I give you Newt Gingrich. And now this guy may sound familiar. He was Speaker of the House then, as we suggested in 1994, and he came up with the idea of the contract with America. So this is a partisan identification, a partisan style of leadership, or somebody who leads not by their own ideology or by their constituency's ideology, but by their party's ideology. In other words, what the party platform says is what a partisan leader will vote for. As evidence for this, I give you the contract with America that I suggested he came into Congress spearheading, that proposed to take the Republican platform of 1992 and operational. His legislative agenda was the party agenda, the party platform. It was a quid pro quo. It was one for one. His platform, his party's platform was his legislative agenda. Finally, we have the Politico. A Politico is somebody, and I try to express it like this, they take the best of all. For instance, I was at a lunch, and he took Death to a Politician, a question and answer period, right, from the community, and this little old lady stood up and said, I disagree with you I think you're not representing your constituency, and here's how. I think, she said, she was a little old lady literally with a cane, shaking it, nothing worse, right? And decried him for not speaking strongly enough against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he took her question, and she sat down, and he said, I was there. He said, you're right. Right? Rule number one in a good politician, disarm them. You're right. But, he said, you have to realize that my job is much bigger. And I have my personal identification, I have my constituents' idea, I have my party idea, and my job is to sew all three together. To take all three elements and be the best Mike Thompson I can be. He said, if I speak with a voice against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan that you want me to, I would disenfranchise myself from my party and from the legislature. I would also not be representing those constituents in my district who feel differently than you. Because although you may feel that you're the majority, public opinion has expressed very mixed emotions about this. And it's not an easy black and white answer, it's very complex. He said, so you have to trust me that when I'm in a venue, when I'm in a situation where I'm able to represent your voice, I do. But not at the expense of being an effective representative overall. I have to maintain my party ties. I have to maintain my integrity with my complete constituency, with my party, and with my own personal ideology. Right? And so by the end of his answer, all the heads were nodding. Right? The little lady was modified, bless her heart. They got it. That's a Politico. That's it. Right? Somebody who can take the best of being trustee, delegate, and partisan and use all of them in one fell swoop. So again, these aren't in the Constitution. These develop, and they're very personal to the legislator.
So just to put a point on this and wrap up this conversation about the different leadership styles, I think we can all agree that any one member of the House or the Senate, when they make a decision to vote aye or nay on any given proposed bill, their thought process differs, well, from one bill to another, and obviously from one member to another. But as I'm trying to express, there are common explanations which vary in importance depending on the situation. First, this trustee style, personal opinion, and judgment. Many members of Congress have strong personal opinions and convictions on issues and cast their votes on bills on the basis of those opinions. Secondly, constituent opinion. This is the delegate. Members of Congress want to be liked by their constituents, surely, and most want to get reelected. So, in voting on particular bills, members often use results of polls, editorial commentary in local media, and social media or letters written to them by their constituents to help them make up their minds in voting on a particular bill. So, when members use constituent opinion as a cue to casting a vote, they are said to be exercising their role as a delegate of the people they represent. But we remember too, Chapter 7, right? Interest groups and lobbying. As a way of achieving their goals, interest groups exert influence on congressional voting in a number of ways, including making contributions to campaigns, PACs, and hiring lobbyists to provide arguments to members regarding why they should vote on a particular bill. So members use both information provided by the lobbyists in aid to their voting and the campaign support from interest groups to prompt how they will vote. The partisan model. The party of a member often conveys quite a bit about his or her political positions and ideology, with Democrats tending to be more liberal on social and economic issues, and Republicans tending to be more conservative on those issues. So party membership is an important cue. In addition, the leadership of each party is organized to influence party members to vote on the party line, and we'll be talking about that here in a second. Members voting with their party tend to be rewarded with better committee assignments and greater campaign funding, thus making party a very important factor in voting on legislation. Now, when I talk about the members voting with their party's political positions and ideology, as I mentioned in the Chapters 8 and 9 lecture, this often comes back to platform. As I just mentioned a minute ago, Newt Gingrich operationalized the 1992 Republican Party platform by introducing it as the Contract with America when he became Speaker of the House in 1994. With this most recent campaign cycle, We remember that the Republican Party did not publish a new platform. They simply reintroduced the existing platform. So while not being refreshed, it does leave Republican legislators in a limbo in trying to represent a party ideology that is over 4 years old. So too is the influence from the president. Presidents are the focus of national attention and have, as President Teddy Roosevelt once said, a bully pulpit to make their case and influence others, including members of Congress. We know that presidents are quite influential in directing congressional members of their own party how to vote, particularly in times of international crisis. Presidents can effectively make appeals to put partisanship aside and convince members to vote in the interests of the country. Finally, another consideration that we haven't really touched on is log rolling. Covered in your book, we know that members often enter into agreement with other members to vote a certain way on a bill in exchange for a favorable vote on another bill. This process is called log rolling. Members vote on thousands of bills in every term. Giving up a vote on a less important bill in exchange for favorable votes on a more important bill is common practice and one that often guides congressional voting behavior. So this is then the leadership style conversation as a structural element in Congress.
There is a leadership system that is evidenced beyond that enumerated in the Constitution. For example, we know that the House, the lower chamber, has the Speaker of the House, the office of the Speaker. That's institutional. Check. Below that, we have the office of the Majority Leader. And so their job then is to, since the office of the Speaker is intended to be non-partisan, since the office of the Speaker is supposed to be the leader of the entire House, regardless of party identification, the office of the Majority Leader is party identified. And his or her job is to lead the party and is to coordinate the activities of the party in the lower chamber.
Whichever party has a majority in the lower chamber will be called the office of the Majority Leader. Whichever party has the minority will be called by the office of the name of that party. So, for example, on this slide, I suggest the office of the Majority Leader and the office of the Democratic Leader. In this manifestation, then, the Republicans would be the majority and the Democrat would be the minority. If the House has a Democratic minority and a Republican minority, then the structure would be the office of the Majority Leader and the office of the Republican Leader.
You have the House Majority Whip and the House Democratic Whip. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's not an acronym. It's not anything to mislead you. Their job is to walk around and whip people into shape, to whip people into party line. So I'm going to visit your office, and we have a piece of legislation, and I'm the House Majority Whip, and you're a Republican. My job is to whip you into shape and to make sure that you're going to vote along party line. We have differences of ideology within party, and that the maverick 16, 19 Tea Party identified members of Congress, both lower and the upper chambers then, aren't acting strictly along Republican Party lines. And it's very hard for, in this instance, the Majority Leader, or God forbid the office of the Speaker, to get those 16 people into line. They're freshmen. They see themselves as Mustangs, as rebels against the party status quo. And their job is to be hard to get into line. So it's fascinating to watch the Majority Leader and the Majority Whip try to get these guys to vote for a party program. Senate, as we know, the Vice President of the United States is an institutional characteristic, but then the President Pro Tem. So the President Pro Tem is an honorific office. In other words, when the President of the Senate, the Vice President, isn't around, it's the President Pro Tem, or the President for now, temporary, until the real President comes back. It's more of an honorific. So this is analogous to the office of the Speaker in the House. In other words, the majority party elects their most senior, most respected member as the President Pro Tem.
Now, to say that the President Pro Tem is a structural characteristic alone is a little misleading, because the President Pro Tem is mentioned in the Constitution in a couple of places. We understand that the Vice President of the United States, serving as President of the Senate, must often be gone, right? They can't always be there. They have other fish to fry as well. So while we consider that the Vice President used to be the Senate's regular presiding officer, then we can better understand why the Constitution further provided that in the absence of the Vice President, the Senate could choose a President Pro Tem to perform the duties of the chair. So he's kind of like a vice president, if you would. The Pro Tem is a Latin term meaning for the time being. Thus, the occupant of the position was conceived as a temporary presiding officer. Since vice presidents presided routinely in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Senate thought it was necessary to choose a President Pro Tem only for the limited periods when the Vice President might be ill or otherwise absent. As a result, the Senate frequently elected several Presidents Pro Tem during a single session. However, especially in unsettling times, there's another important element to the President Pro Tem, and that is presidential succession. The importance of the post of President Pro Tem can be seen by its placement in the presidential line of succession. According to the Presidential Succession Act of 1792, should the offices of the President and Vice President both become vacant, the President Pro Tem would have succeeded to the presidency, followed by the Speaker of the House. This line of succession remained in effect until 1886. The agreement created a serious consequence on at least one occasion. When President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, President Andrew Johnson succeeded to the presidency. When Johnson was impeached in 1868, President Pro Tem Benjamin Wade of Ohio stood to gain from that conviction. Had the Senate voted to convict and remove Johnson from office, remember it only fell one vote short of the necessary two-thirds majority to convict, then Senator Wade would have become President of the United States. And so Senator Wade, it should be noted, cast his vote in favor of conviction, and President Johnson, after his acquittal, objected to placing the President Pro Tem in the line of succession because he would therefore be an interested party in producing a vacancy. And so it was flipped then, and now we have the Speaker of the House as number 3 and the President Pro Tem as number 4. And as we'll talk about in Chapter 11, 10 and 11, that further goes down to the cabinet secretaries in order of seniority of the cabinet departments. So the President Pro Tem isn't just a smiling face. There's real oomph behind that position.
Below them, then, you have the real leadership, the majority leader and the assistant majority leader, the minority leader and the assistant minority leader. So in the Senate as well, you have the party conferences, policy committees, and secretaries that are party-specific or partisan-identified. The House Majority Leader, the Majority Leader's second most senior official in the House, is the day-to-day manager of business on the floor. The House, the lower chamber, Majority Whip. The responsibilities of the Majority Whip include persuading members to support the party's positions on votes. The House Minority Leader serves as a senior official for the minority party. The minority leader works with party members to set the party agenda, set the party message, and strategy. Remember party and government from Chapter 8? This is they. And then the House Minority Whip. The responsibilities of the Minority Whip are counting the votes and persuading members of the minority party to support the party's position on vote. The Senate Majority Leader, then, the most senior Senate official, next to the President and the President Pro Tem, which we know are largely ceremonial, as the day-to-day business manager on the Senate floor, the Senate Majority Leader is responsible for working with each committee on legislation and scheduling the sequence and manner of debate on all legislation. So in about half an hour, we're going to get to how a bill becomes a law, right? And the discussion in the committees and in the subcommittees. So how the Senate Majority Leader is responsible for working with each committee on legislation is going to be vitally important, because if the real working of Congress gets done in committees, who coordinates the activities of the committees is going to be the real power. So we're talking about the Senate Majority Leader, the leader of the majority party calling the shots as to committee assignments and how a committee conducts its business insofar as discussing a piece of legislation. Very powerful, party identified, structural element. The Senate Assistant Majority Leader assists the Majority Leader, persuading members to support the party's position on votes and projecting support for the party's position, again, party and government. And then again for the Minority Leader and the Minority Whip, the same thing just for the minority parties. The caucuses. Now, we talked about this a little bit in Party and Government, but let's just revisit. So these are the committees or the collective bodies of the Democrats in the House, of the Republicans in the House, or in the Senate. And so again, the caucus is the primary vehicle for communicating the party's message to members. The House Democratic Caucus has a chairman who directs the operations of the caucus, of the gathering of Democrats, assisted by a vice chairman, both of which are elected positions within the party. And we remember, too, that all these have websites. We did this with Party and Government, right? And so we're revisiting them again. Parties are interest groups on steroids. Their job in the website isn't to educate themselves. They know what their job is. This website's intention is to educate us, the electorate, about what the party and government is doing. Again, if you're trying to show me, Mike, this is how Congress organizes itself structurally, I jump up and down madly and I say, party, party, party. It's party identified. It's run on a party identification. So the leadership is party identified. The caucuses, the policy committees, they're all party identified. There are no term limits in the federal government, with the exception of the presidency. There is no term limits for the Senate, for the House. Obviously, there are no term limits for the federal judiciary. They're appointed for life. At the national level, then what does this create as a structural element? Seniority. If there isn't a stop in the Constitution that says you can only have 2 terms, or you can only have 6 terms, or you can only have 8 terms, there is no natural stop limiting you. You can serve as long as you want. The idea then is seniority. So if you look at the structural elements, what are the pros and cons, or how does this contribute to or inhibit
the pluralist ideal?
Well, okay, looking at it from both sides just very quickly, we have Dianne Feinstein, who's very senior, as I suggested, by virtue of her seniority, especially when her party's in the majority, she's powerful. She's on important committees. She's on the Judiciary Committee. She's on the Armed Forces Committee. Those are both very powerful committees, and so she's able to help direct the future of the country by virtue of her seniority. She carries with her institutional memory. She carries with her a vast network. She knows how to get stuff done. Not only in Washington, but her offices then in California, her 5 offices up and down the state. She's very effective in what she does. And this is by virtue, you could argue, of her seniority. Because she's been around for so long, she has power, she has connections, she has political savvy, she has that memory. The other side of the story is she's been in office since God was a little boy. And so what does she know of, public discourse? What does she know of public opinion? What does she know of what it means to be a Californian? Is she out of touch? You know, this is subjective, right? I don't know Dianne Feinstein. Never met her. I don't know if she's out of touch. But the idea is that the longer you're in office, the more of an insider you become. The less likely you are to really, truly represent your constituency because you don't know what their life is like. If we go back to the Federalist paper who said in order to be a true representative, you have to have your finger on the pulse of your constituency. You have to know what your constituency is facing on a day-to-day basis. Do you get that through public opinion polls? Do you get that through statistics? Or do you get that by having to bring home the bacon and go to class at night and work a full-time job and et cetera, right? So term limits, there are no term limits. They've tried to instill term limits at the national level. It's never passed. It would have to be a constitutional amendment because the Constitution doesn't require term limits, just as term limits for the presidency was. Pros and cons. Advance or inhibit pluralism. The more voices, the better. The fresher voices, the better. Obviously, advance pluralism.
Now we're really going to start to get to the nuts and bolts of how the operations, the structural characteristics of Congress, support or impede the pluralist ideal.
When looking at majoritarian or pluralist views of committees and the committee structure in Congress, government by committee vests a tremendous amount of power in the committees and subcommittees of Congress, especially in their leaders. This is particularly true of the House, which has a more decentralized pattern of influence than the Senate, and is more restrictive about letting members amend legislation on the floor. Committee members can bury a bill by not reporting it to the full House or Senate. The influence of committee members extends even further to what is called floor debate. Many of them also make up the conference committees charged with developing compromise versions of the bill. So in some ways, the committee system enhances the force of pluralism in American politics. Representatives and senators are elected by the voters in particular districts and states, and they tend to seek membership on the committees that make decisions most important to their constituents. As I'm going to suggest herein, members from farm areas, for example, desperately want membership on the House or the Senate agricultural committees. As a result, committees with members who represent constituencies with an unusually strong interest in their policy area are predisposed to write legislation favorable to those constituencies. And just to recap, we touched on this a few chapters ago, the majoritarian model of democracy relies on our intuitive notion of what is fair. It interprets government by the people as government by the majority of the people. To force the government to respond to public opinion, the majoritarian model depends on several mechanisms that allow the people to participate directly. So the popular election of government officials is the primary mechanism for democratic government in the majoritarian model. Citizens are expected to control their representatives' behavior by choosing wisely in the first place and then re-electing or voting out of public office people according to their performance. So majoritarian theorists also see elections as a means for deciding governmental policies. An election on a policy issue really is called a referendum, right? When a policy question is put on the ballot by the action of citizens circulating petitions and gathering a required minimum number of signatures, that's called an initiative. But a referendum speaks to how a person is doing in their job, right? Is Dianne Feinstein performing her function well? That is a referendum on her for performance. And so the majoritarian model then seeks to force Dianne Feinstein to represent the majority voice. Now, this is differentiated from the pluralist model of democracy, right, that interprets government by the people to mean that government by the people operating through competing interests, right, or through this pluralistic model. So according to this model, then, democracy exists when many, the plural, organizations operate separately from the government and press their interests on the government and even challenge the government. So we're looking at pluralism as opposed to majoritarianism, and that's what I'm after in this segment. Well, the committees have a majoritarian aspect as well. The membership of most committees tends to resemble the general ideological profiles of the two parties' congressional contingents. If a committee's views are not in line with the views of the full membership, the committee is constrained in the legislation it writes because bills cannot become law unless they are passed by the parent chamber and the other house. Consequently, then, in formulating legislation, committees anticipate what other representatives and senators will accept. The parties within each chamber also have the means of rewarding the members who are most loyal to party priorities, as we've discussed. Party committees and party leadership within each chamber make committee assignments and respond to requests for transfers from less prestigious to more prestigious committees. Those whose voting is most in line with the party get the best assignments.
The committee structure in Congress, as we'll be coming back to, there are standing committees. Standing committees are those committees that continue to exist regardless of the Congress. So as we go from one Congress to the next, the Congress is reelected every 2 years, right? The Senate, we know, 1/3, but every 2 years is a new Congress, and they're enumerated. 113th, 114th, 115th Congress. Each Congress, then, has standing committees. And these are listed in your book, where in the House you have the Committee on Agriculture, Appropriations, Armed Services, Budget, Energy and Commerce, Ethics, Financial Affairs, Foreign Affairs, House Committee standing committees. In the Senate, there are fewer because there are fewer senators, and the focus of the Senate is a little different. They focus more on foreign affairs and judicial appointments because those are enumerated powers specific to the Senate. We have standing committees, but then we have subcommittees.
For example, you have the Committee on Agriculture in the House, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry in the Senate. If you think about tobacco, the Tobacco Subcommittee of the Agriculture Committee is going to be huge. And if you're from the South or if you're from a tobacco-growing state and you're a representative from a tobacco-growing district, you want on that committee because your constituents are going to be very interested in tobacco policy at the local level. So if you're serving on the tobacco committee, then you're going to be able to represent your constituents' voice. Now, in this instance, it might be those constituents who electioneered you into office, if you're looking at the tobacco industry, and look at the people who donated to a political campaign or electioneered a political campaign. And so you look at campaign finance reform and an undue influence on policy is going to be happening at the subcommittee level. Now, I'm going to introduce in just a little bit a policy issue for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And we're going to run that through a schematic of how a bill becomes a law, looking at pluralism and the pluralist model specifically. And we'll come back to the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Telecommunications Subcommittee. Conference committees, as your book suggests, a special joint committee appointed to reconcile differences between bills when two bills pass the two different chambers of Congress. So we're going to come back to this again, but if a bill is introduced in the House, it's going to go through the process of deliberation, testimony, marking up in committee in the House, and that's going to be a House-specific conversation. It's going to come out of the House as a complete bill, approved by the House, and then reintroduced in the Senate. We know this from high school civics class, right? But then when it's reintroduced into the Senate, it goes through the Senate's processes. It goes through their committee structure. It goes through their conversation and their markups and their changes, so that when it comes out of the Senate, it's going to look significantly different from the one that came out of the House, yes? It should. If it doesn't, I'd be worried. If it comes out of the House and into the Senate, comes out of the Senate exactly as it came in, what the hell do they do? Their job is to tear it apart and mark it up, right? And deliberate it from the Senate's perspective. It should come out different. So then the conference committee is a committee made up of both members of the House and the Senate whose job it is to compromise between two versions of the bill, right? And so they're empowered to accept certain changes to the bill within limits so that the bill can go forward to the president without having to go through the whole process again. Joint committees are a legislative committee composed of members of both chambers. A select committee is a temporary legislative committee established for a limited time period for a very special purpose. So a joint committee, for example, might deal with the economy, taxation, or supervision of the Library of Congress. It isn't a standing committee. It doesn't move from Congress to Congress. It's established to look at a specific problem. Select committees, a temporary legislative committee established for a limited time, you might argue, you want my favorite example? Teddy Roosevelt introduced immigration reform bill at the turn of the century. And Teddy Roosevelt, as we're going to show next week, was a very powerful, very vibrant president. He was very bullheaded and had an idea of the way things were going to work. And he introduced a piece of legislation, this immigration reform. And what he did was he selected a hand-picked group of senators and congresspeople to go forward to Europe and investigate immigration from Europe's perspective. What was it about Europe that was causing this great flood? Remember, this is turn of the century, right? Causing this great flood of immigrants, especially from Hungary, from Poland, from Italy. And so he had this piece of legislation already crafted. He knew what he wanted, but he handpicked the leaders of the Congress, the Senate and the House, in a select committee, and he sent them to Europe during the summer with all their family, their support staff, on a 2 to 3 month investigatory tour of Europe to find out why immigration. So they went to Europe, they went to Italy, they went to Hungary, they went to Poland. They had this great tour to investigate immigration with their wives and their kids and their staff. And they came back and surprise, surprise, they introduced the piece of legislation exactly as Teddy Roosevelt had envisioned it. Another is the President's Inaugural Committee. A president doesn't put on his own inauguration. Congress puts it on for him. The outgoing president surely doesn't. So who's going to
coordinate all the aspects of an inauguration. It's a select committee of Congress.
So because committees are so vital, so foundational to our question of the structural elements of Congress that support or impede the pluralist ideal, I think a quick recap is in order. So Congress divides its legislative oversight and internal administrative tasks among more than 200 committees and subcommittees. Within assigned areas, these functional subunits gather information, compare and evaluate legislative alternatives, identify policy problems, and propose solutions, select, determine, and report measures for full chamber consideration, monitor executive branch performance, i.e. oversight, and investigate allegations of wrongdoing. The 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act sets the framework for the modern committee system. The Act organized the Senate and House committees along roughly parallel lines, but divergences have emerged over time. Within the guidelines of chamber rules that we're going to talk about, each committee adopts its own rules addressing organizational, structural, and procedural issues. So again, all this is structural. None of this is in the Constitution. Which brings up a really interesting point. Where does the power of the legislature to create its own rules then come from? If it's not institutional, if it's not in the Constitution, where does that power lie? How is it structural? Well, in the exercise of their constitutional power to determine the rules of their proceedings, the houses of Congress may not ignore constitutional restraints or violate fundamental rights, and there should be a reasonable relation between the mode or method of processing established by the rule and the result which is sought to be obtained. But within these limitations, all matters of method are open to the determination of the House. The power to make rules is not one which is exercised and then exhausted. It is a continuous power, always subject to be exercised by the House, and within the limitations suggested, absolute and beyond the challenge of any other body or tribunal. As a consequence, there is considerable variation among panels and across chambers. And so in our most recent Congress, there were 20 standing committees in the House with 97 subcommittees and one select committee. The Senate has 16 committees with 68 subcommittees, as well as 4 select or special committees. There were also 4 joint committees. So again, there are 3 main types of committees: standing, select, or special, and joint. There are party committees, task forces, and congressional member organizations that we've talked about, but these are informal groups and are not addressed in this structural element. Standing committees are permanent panels, identified as such in each chamber's rules. Because they have legislative jurisdiction, standing committees consider bills and issues and recommend measures for consideration by their respective chambers. They also have oversight responsibility to monitor agencies, programs, and activities within their jurisdictions, and in some cases in areas that cut across committee jurisdictions. Most standing committees recommend funding levels, authorizations, for government operations and for new and existing programs. A few have other functions. For example, the Appropriations Committee recommended legislation to provide budget authority for federal agencies and programs. The Budget Committees establish aggregate levels for total spending and revenue via the annual budget resolution that serve as guidelines for the work of the authorizing and appropriating panels. Special or select committees are generally established by separate resolution of the chamber, sometimes to conduct investigations and studies, and on other occasions also to consider measures. Often, select committees examine emerging issues that do not fit clearly within existing standing committee jurisdictions or cut across jurisdictional boundaries. A select committee may be a permanent or temporary institution. Select committees may have certain restrictions on member tenure and may include certain specified representatives, i.e. party leaders or certain standing committee chairs, as ex officio, i.e. non-voting members.
Instead of the term select, the Senate sometimes uses the term special committee, i.e. the Special Committee on Aging. So joint committees are made up of members of both the House and the Senate. Today's permanent joint committees conduct studies and perform housekeeping tasks rather than consider measures. For instance, the Joint Committee on Printing oversees the functions of the Government Publishing Office and general printing procedures of the federal government. The chairmanship of joint committees usually alternates between House and Senate. A conference committee is a temporary joint committee formed to resolve differences between competing House and Senate versions of a measure. Conference committees draft compromises between the position of the two chambers, which are then submitted to the full House and Senate for approval. Now, really the bulk of work, my friends, gets done in subcommittees. Subcommittees is where pluralism and the pluralist ideal is alive and well. Most committees form subcommittees to share specific tasks within the jurisdiction of the full committee. Subcommittees are responsible to and work within the guidelines established by their parent committees. In particular, standing committees usually create subcommittees with legislative jurisdiction to consider and report bills. They may assign their committees such specific tasks as the initial consideration of measures and oversight of laws and programs in the subcommittee's areas. So, again, I can't emphasize this enough. Subcommittees play the most important role in the legislative process. Because few chamber and party rules apply to subcommittees, the number, prerogatives, and autonomy of subcommittees vary, which is in effect pluralism. Senate rules do not directly limit the subcommittees each committee may create. Well, House rules impose a maximum of 5 subcommittees for most committees, but a 6th oversight subcommittee is often permitted. Several committees, such as the Appropriations Committee, have been allowed, via House rules or a separate order in the opening day rules resolution, a larger number of subcommittees. Some committees create independent subcommittees with sizable staff and their own budgets, routinely refer measures to subcommittees for initial consideration, and allow subcommittees to take the lead in framing issues, drafting measures and reports, and holding hearings and markups. On other committees, most work is undertaken by the full committee. Some full committees repeat all actions taken by their subcommittees, while others review only major subcommittee work or even forward subcommittee reported measures to the floor for a vote with little change. And just, to beat this horse senseless, where does Congress get the authority to create such a convoluted system? All these committees and standing committees and joint committees, it all seems rather confusing, right? And this is what the Anti-Federalists, if we remember at the beginning of today's lecture, argued, that it would be too confusing, that we wouldn't know where to point, we, the electorate, wouldn't know where to point. What was the reasoning? Well, going back again to the Federalists, we see exactly how this developed and why it's so important, why we have such a confusing system in Congress. The items in Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, giving each branch of the legislature control over its own proceedings, really reflect a long-standing desire dating back to the gradual evolution of the English Parliament as a legislative body with powers independent of those of the king, in order to preserve the independence of the legislature from executive encroachment. So this section of the Constitution creates the institutional characteristic that allows this structural organization, that allows this expression of pluralism by encouraging openness in the publication and dissemination of the proceedings of Congress. Unique procedures. All right, so unique procedure to the House and to the Senate. So in the Senate you have filibuster and cloture, and in the House you have a discharge petition and order. And you may have heard the term filibuster. You may have heard the term cloture. Less likely to hear the term cloture. A filibuster is when a senator is able to get up and single-handedly stop a piece of legislation in its tracks by talking it to death. So here's the idea. Filibuster is that if you can get the floor, you can talk a bill to death. And so the idea is you get up and you say, as Ted Cruz did while he was reading a bedtime story to his daughters, if memory serves, right, with green eggs and ham. It doesn't matter. You can say, this piece of legislation reminds me of the novel War and Peace. And here's how. I'm going to read it to you. War and Peace. The idea is you literally talk it to death, that you stop legislation because you have the floor, and once you have the floor, it's yours. Why is it important to pluralism? The idea that a senator can stop a piece of legislation in and of themselves, by themselves, right, is a strong minority protection, or the protection of minority rights. Now, cloture, it means sit down and shut up. So 2/3 of the Senate getting together to vote can say, we forced you to sit down and take the floor back. But there is an element in cloture that says if you invoke it, you have to vote on the bill within a certain amount of time, or it fails. So you're kind of calling the question.
So again, the operations of the House and the Senate are structured by formal rules and informal norms of behavior. Rules in each chamber are mostly matters of parliamentary procedure. For example, they govern the scheduling of legislation, outlining when and how certain types of legislation can be brought to the floor. An important difference between the two chambers is the House's use of the Rules Committee to govern floor debate. We'll talk about that. Lacking a similar committee to act as a traffic cop for legislation approaching the floor, the Senate relies on unanimous consent agreements to set the starting time and length of debate. If only one senator objects to an agreement, it does not take effect. Senators do not routinely object to unanimous consent agreements, however, because they know they will need them when bills of their own await scheduling by the leadership. So a senator who wants to stop a bill badly enough simply starts this filibuster, as I'm suggesting, and in its classic form simply talk the bill to death. So by historical tradition, the Senate gives its members the right of unlimited debate. This is pluralism at its heart. The record for holding the floor belongs to Republican Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina for a 24-hour, 18-minute marathon. In the House, no member is allowed to speak for more than an hour without unanimous consent, so we'll come back to the House in a second. So, after a 1917 filibuster by a small group of senators killed President Wilson's bill to arm merchant ships, a bill favored by majority senators, the Senate finally adopted cloture, a means of limiting debate. This cloture petition, signed by 16 senators, initiates a cloture vote. It now takes the votes of 60 senators to invoke cloture, which creates a time limit for the debate. So, since the 1960s, the filibuster has taken on a variety of new forms that do not actually require a senator to occupy the floor and speak continuously. Today, the term filibuster is applied to a parliamentary device in the Senate that blocks action on the bill as if a senator were speaking, but still allows business on other issues to take place. So they're just getting a little more pragmatic about it. Because a senator can now filibuster without actually occupying the floor, speaking continuously about the bill, it is much easier to maintain a filibuster, and they have become much more commonplace. They have also raised considerable controversy, particularly when senators prevented votes on a number of nominees for the federal judiciary during the administrations of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Several proposals have emerged that would reduce the number of votes required for cloture, specifically on judicial.
Now, this is a Senate-only unique procedure, a structural element. It's not in the Constitution. Oftentimes when you hear about filibuster, the news will say this is a constitutional crisis because they're using filibuster to stop the process of a piece of legislation, which is not true because it's not in the Constitution. This is a rule created by the Senate for the Senate. If they choose to do away with it, fine. It's not in the Constitution. It's simply a rule they made up to govern their own proceeding. A piece of legislation introduced into the House, and it goes into the hopper for assignment out to the committees. As I said, the Speaker of the House and the leadership positions in the House of Representatives have strong enough power
that if a piece of legislation goes into the hopper and it's not assigned out to legislation, it dies. It dies in the hopper. So I said these are very powerful positions, right? Now, a discharge petition, if you can get 2/3 of the House of Representatives, a supermajority, to vote to discharge that piece of legislation and force the leadership to put it out to committee, then you have the same fact. But in this instance, it's the party who's putting the kibosh on further discussion of the bill, and not a single senator. So both of which are intended to protect the minority, but there are mechanisms within both to circumvent that effort.
We now turn our attention to the role of incumbent advantage as a structural element and how it contributes to or detracts from pluralist ideal.
90% of incumbent members of the House of Representatives get reelected if they seek reelection. Let me say that again because this is very important. 90% of incumbent members of the House, the lower chamber, get reelected if they seek reelection.
Now, my friends, this is huge insofar as structural elements that contribute to or detract from pluralist ideal. Now, the lack of term limits, we said, is an institutional characteristic because it's not in the Constitution. Seniority is a structural characteristic that arises from the lack of term limits. So what we're looking at then is incumbent advantage, right? The incumbency factor. We appreciate that each state or congressional district really is a unique electoral arena. We've touched on this. We've covered this several times. Diversity among constituencies underlies the pluralist ideal. As I said, San Diego versus the Inland Empire versus Gold Country versus Sonoma or Napa. The astonishing variety of political forces operating in these congressional districts then are reflected through and in congressional politics. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the electoral importance of individual candidates and campaigns expanded, while that of party labels and national issues diminished, as we touched on in chapters 8 and 9. The emergence of a more candidate-centered electoral process helped one class of congressional candidates to prosper, the incumbent office holders. Indeed, the electoral advantage enjoyed by incumbents, at least as measured by electoral margins, increased so notably after the mid-1960s that it became the main focus of congressional electoral research for the next quarter century, giving multiple political scientists lots and lots of work. This research leaves little doubt that incumbency confers major electoral benefits, but it also reveals that these benefits are neither automatic nor certain nor constant across electoral contexts. Even during the 1970s and 80s, when House incumbents were riding their highest impressive re-election rates and expanded electoral margins seemed ever more dearly bought, the pursuit of re-election absorbed a great deal of time, energy, and money, reflecting members' enduring sense of electoral uncertainty and risk. The electoral upheavals of the early 1990s show that their worry was not misplaced. The advantages of incumbency are far more contingent than the surface evidence might have even suggested. So, nonetheless, incumbency stands out as a conspicuous factor in congressional elections from almost any perspective. Most obviously, incumbency is a dominant consideration because incumbents are so consistently successful at winning elections, and everyone in politics knows it. At a deeper level, nearly everything pertaining to candidates and campaigns for Congress is profoundly influenced by whether the candidate is an incumbent, or challenging an incumbent, or pursuing an open seat. And understanding why and how modern incumbents have usually done so well is central to comprehending the strengths and weaknesses of the House, specifically as a pluralistic institution.
Why? What is it about being an incumbent, or somebody who actually holds the seat, actually has the office, that propels them into re-election, that allows them the secureness of re-election. I would argue that there are incumbent advantages that are extant as structural elements and some institutional elements that help this. So let's, for a moment, humor me. You have candidate A and candidate B. Candidate A is already a seated member of Congress. They're a member of the House of Representatives. So you have candidate A, who is an incumbent. Candidate B, let's say, is me, and I want to challenge Mike Thompson for office. What is it that Mike Thompson has that I don't have? What incumbent advantage does he have that he can use to his re-election? Seniority? How so?
Well, he's got connections.
He's got connections. Okay, so taking that on a little bit then, he's got the public's attention. When Mike Thompson holds a press conference, they show up. Media show up. If I hold a press conference, good luck, right? I'm nobody. They don't know me. So I have to have some kind of oomph, some kind of trick to get them there. Step back a minute. How do you know Mike Thompson exists? How do you know the name Mike Thompson?
Because he won already.
Because he won already.
Media.
Name recognition. Mike Thompson. Name recognition you're very good, is a big part of getting reelected. Simply knowing the name Mike Thompson, when you go to the voting booth, you say, oh, Mike Thompson. I know that. Name. You think this is crazy? Why do people have lawn signs for local elections? Well, all it says is their name. What good is that? Name recognition, when you go to the polling booth, name recognition drives people to pull a lever. You recognize the name, you vote for that name, even though you don't know who that person is or what they stand for. I know it's nuts, but that's name recognition. It's a big part of incumbent advantage. So you're absolutely right. Experience and being an incumbent means that he's already got some level of name recognition. How does his incumbency further advantage name recognition? The frank is an element as an institutional characteristic in the Constitution that says that he has the government-backed ability to communicate with his constituents. The frank originally meant that he could use the post office free to communicate with his constituencies because that communication was part of the deliberative process, it's part of representation, it's part of being a republic. And so Mike Thompson being able to mail stuff to his constituents free is a part of his job. But wait, we're talking name recognition. And we're talking 1788, 1789, when the frank meant a postal stamp. If you're talking about communicating with your constituency, you're talking internet. You're talking Facebook, you're talking social media, you're talking Twitter, you're talking a whole other array of communication elements. And so the courts have found that if the frank meant communication, this is communication. And so these wonderful websites that we bring up, looking at Dianne Feinstein, Mike Thompson, those are all paid for by the frank. Now, anybody who's worth their weight in salt knows how much these darn websites cost to build and to maintain, and the bandwidth. Now, candidate A, Thompson, has all that for free at taxpayers' expense because it's part of the frank. Candidate B has to make that for themselves. Travel. Mike Thompson gets 2 trips to and from Washington, D.C. per month. And within California, within his constituency at state. And so Mike Thompson then, traveling to and from Washington means that he gets to be in Washington and have fundraisers and high-level meetings and media attention and resources and connections that I, candidate B, don't have. And he gets to go back and forth twice. Now, within his constituency for District 5 isn't a big deal. But translate it to senator and free travel within their constituency in California, Sacramento, LA, San Diego, Fresno, Bakersfield, Eureka, Fortuna, anywhere they want to go at state expense. Candidate B, I need to pay for that myself. So this is an incumbent advantage, yes? What other resources then are available? So special interest groups are going to be paying into a winnable election. And so if Mike Thompson has 90% of getting reelected, what you're suggesting is that the special interests, the political action committees who are going to contribute to campaigns are going to bet on a winning horse. You have 90% chance of winning. They're going to contribute to his campaign, and all the campaign money is going to go to him, or most of it. If you're talking about incumbent advantage, then when you win election to office, the first thing you do when you sit down is to start running for re-election, because 2 years is going to go by awfully fast. So running for re-election means getting your war chest set. So what other resources? What about your state offices? So if you're Mike Thompson and you have an office in Napa and you have an office in Santa Rosa, your offices are meant to provide constituent service.
And not just constituent service.
If you think about it, with the 435 House members and 100 senators who are supported by large professional staff, many of whom are young, recent college graduates, staffers perform a variety of support functions related to the roles of members of Congress that contribute to their incumbent advantage. They conduct background research on bills, help generate new ideas for bills, provide services to constituents, and aid in the oversight of executive agencies. So really there are three categories of congressional staff who are contributing to Mike Thompson's incumbent advantage. First is the members' congressional personal staff. So members of Congress are given a budget to support a group of staffers to assist them. They typically have staff in their D.C. office and one in their home district office. The personal staffers serve a number of legislative support functions, as I suggest, including tracking bills that the member has introduced and conducting research on new ideas for bills. But they also work with the local media in the member's home district, answering journalists' questions, providing information on the member's legislative activities. Perhaps the personal staffer's most important responsibility is responding to constituents in the district. House and Senate members receive many kinds of communications from constituents, ranging from requests for information about bills and explanations of why they voted a particular way, to letters expressing opinions on various issues and requesting speaking engagements. The personal staffers are responsible for dealing with these myriad constituent inquiries. A second type of staffing resource at a congressperson's disposal is the congressional committee staff, where each standing committee of Congress employs a professional staff, many of whom are policy or legal experts in the policy area of the committee and therefore contribute to the incumbent legislator's success. A third form of support for incumbent congresspersons are congressional agencies. So the volume of legislative work, as we can understand, has grown substantially over the years, as has the complexity of the federal budget and the policy issues with which Congress deals. One way the Congress has dealt with problems of growth and complexity has been to delegate authority to executive agencies. Consequently, Congress has begun to lose some control of the ability to keep tabs on those agencies and what they're doing. The explosion of the budget deficits in the 1970s and suspicions about the administration that were inspired by Watergate also left Congress feeling that it lacked necessary information for executive oversight. So the congressional agencies' support staff, in following up with the legislators, help contribute significantly to their incumbent advantage. So the support staff alone helps a congressperson get reelected.
Constituent service at the local level means if you have a problem with the federal government, if your mom didn't get her Social Security check, or if you need a letter of support for an application to the Naval Academy, you're going to need to get support from your senator or your representative. You think I'm crazy? Anybody will ever go to D.C., Washington, D.C.? If you want to tour the Capitol, do you know who you have to go to? Your representative or your senator. So this is constituent service. Now, why do they do that? So you go to Washington and you want to get your tour of the Capitol. Where you usually start is in your representative's office. So incumbent advantage means that there's elements in being an incumbent that's going to get you reelected. How does this help or hinder pluralism? If you're an elected official and you're doing well and you're serving your constituency, maybe you deserve to be returned to office. And maybe by virtue of your seniority and your connections and your know-how and your political savvy, maybe you're going to serve your constituents well. Conversely, if you're candidate B, poor schmuck that I am, good luck. Dianne Feinstein, you may remember, didn't even debate her challenger in her last election. She didn't need to. But then what happens to pluralism, right? When you're not even willing to debate, what happens to that free discourse of ideas?
Now we turn our attention to compensation. What do these guys and gals get paid? Now, this isn't necessarily a structural characteristic that directly supports or impedes the pluralist ideal, but if we're thinking about who becomes senators, who becomes representatives, what they get paid is an important element of who that job can attract. George Washington, as I'm going to suggest, thought this very thing. So let's examine this just very quickly.
So how much do these guys and gals make? Interesting stuff. $165 average.
Now, again, that's a lot of money. I wouldn't turn my nose up at it, for sure. But when you consider what you give up for that 165 a year, right? I mean, if you're a representative, if you're a senator, your life has changed. The Senate leadership, a little bit more. So 183.5 for Harry Reid, the minority leader, 183.5. The majority leader, Speaker of the House, 212. Cantor makes 183. Minority leader, 183.5. Not bad.
So George Washington argued that both the president and, well, by extension, legislators should receive a salary. There was a move at first to suggest that the representatives, the senators, and the president would serve voluntarily. George Washington made the point that in order to inure somebody from the potential of bribery or selling his influence, which is echoed by the Constitution in the restriction against receiving emoluments or benefits personally by virtue of your being in office, the emoluments clause, that enough salary for a livable wage, but not too much salary so that by being a public servant, one would not become fabulously wealthy, would attract the kind of person to public office that Washington thought would be the best representative. Somebody who wanted to serve the people, not to get rich, but to be remunerated for their time and for their effort at a reasonable level. We now turn our attention to redistricting and gerrymandering.
Reapportionment, redistricting, and gerrymandering. Now, this is for the House only. You're looking at proportionate representation. In other words, a representative district should have roughly the same number of noses district to district, right? Can you draw those district lines to either capture or exclude specific populations? The cartoon that's shown in your book, and it's the original, and had to do with Representative Jerry. And you'll see that it looks rather, well, it looks to me like a dragon, but they said it looked like a salamander, like a lizard. And so they conflated the two terms, Representative Jerry and a salamander, and came up with the term gerrymander. And so that's where it comes from. And the idea is to redistrict with an eye to a political end, to either include or disclude a suspect population. So if you're a representative and you're a Republican, perhaps what you're trying to do is exclude a large number of Democrats to create for yourself a safe seat so that you don't have to work so hard to be reelected or to ensure your reelection. So to redistrict for political lines is politically unethical. Who does the redistricting? The states. The states are given their number of districts, and by the decennial census, or the census that takes place every 10 years, according to the Constitution's mandate, they redistrict. They, the states, redistrict. So we're given a set number of districts or a set number of representatives in California, and how we redistrict is distinct to California, is distinct from Texas. Now, Texas just faced a lawsuit not a year ago, 2 years ago, where they redistricted early and redistricted to a political end. They were sued, Texas were sued by the minority party, not surprising, to force the issue that they couldn't redistrict early. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a state can't redistrict as often as it likes. It's after the decennial census that they redistrict because that's when the new numbers are out, the new nose count is out. They did it to a political end, though, and it was proven that they redistricted early to a political end. So it wasn't that they did it early or more often, they did it to achieve an end, and that was incorrect.
Now, I don't want to skip over this too quickly because gerrymandering is an important element when you're looking at the role of Congress and its structural elements and pluralism, or the pluralist ideal. So recently, the Center for American Progress published a report that found that unfairly drawn congressional districts shifted, on average, 59 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives during the 2012, 14, and 16 elections. So that means that every other November, 59 politicians that might not have been elected based on statewide voter count for their party won anyway because the lines were drawn in their favor, often by their allies in either the Republican or Democratic Party. So to help put this in perspective, a shift of 59 seats is slightly more than the total number of seats apportioned to the 22 smallest states by population. It's also more than the number of representatives
for America's largest state, California, where we have 53 House members representing our population of nearly 40 million people. Of the 59 seats that were shifted per election due to partisan gerrymandering, 20 shifted in favor of Democrats, while 39 shifted in favor of Republicans. This means that from 2012 to 2016, the net two-party impact amounted to an average gain of 19 Republican seats per election, which is still more than the number of seats in a dozen U.S. states. Well, one can also look at the effects of gerrymandering in terms of population. The average congressional district has a population of slightly more than 700,000, which means that a total shift of 59 seats is equivalent to representation for approximately 42 million Americans. However, the 19 net seats Republicans gained are equivalent to representation for about 13.5 million Americans. So, the inescapable conclusion is that gerrymandering is effectively disenfranchising millions of Americans. This should be considered a critical situation. If the voters of even one of these states above were excluded from the count, there would be a national outcry with a net impact equivalent to the exclusion of 12 states. The urgent need to address gerrymandering should be clear. Now, President Obama, when he left office, through his foundation, saw it as a primary focus to stop gerrymandering. Now, as I suggest, gerrymandering is something that both the Democrats and the Republicans do. As usual, as ever, I'm not being partisan or polemical. However, both sides need to understand that gerrymandering and messing with the Democratic representation reduces pluralism because it inaccurately reflects the will of the public in the makeup of Congress. And now we turn our attention to the actual legislative process. This is a long lecture, I know. Bear with me.
The legislative process, here we are, finally. So how a bill becomes a law, and again, we're always looking for the pluralistic, the more voices, the better. So draft bills from members of Congress, from the administration, or from others. I don't know if you can see up there, this slide. Who then might introduce a piece of legislation? Is it simply a House member? Are they the only people who might introduce a piece of legislation? The president, obviously, through a member of the House or through a member of the Senate, can also introduce pieces of legislation. But who else? Perhaps you're the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association. Would it be possible then for them to come up with a piece of draft legislation, give it to Mike Thompson, and ask Mike Thompson then for his support or for him to introduce it? Interest groups are a large participant in the legislative process in that they often provide the language for pieces of legislation. And as we go into our model of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I'll give you an example of that. So it's introduced either into the House and to the Senate, and then as I suggested, and as your book talks about, it goes into committee action or inaction, right? If it goes into committee, and in committee, those list of committees that we talked about, if they discuss it, if they talk about it, if they mark it up, if they investigate, if they call in testimony, if they call in experts, they develop that piece of legislation, they do their job, or perhaps they get the piece of legislation and they do nothing with it. That's called dying in committee, that the legislation dies in committee. In the House, then, we know that it's the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader who have the political power to get it out of committee or to force the committee to act on a piece of legislation, to use their influence along party lines to get that piece of legislation moving. If you're the minority party, you don't have that. Oh, what do you have? Discharge petition. This is really interesting because a lot of pieces of legislation are introduced, you'll have to forgive me just for a minute, with an eye toward dying in committee. Sometimes a piece of legislation is introduced just for the theater, for the political theater. Now, at the local level, you may want to consider that in San Francisco, a county supervisor just introduced a piece of policy at the local level, this is in San Francisco, for adding 2 cents per ounce tax on sugared beverages. Anybody hear of this? Now, there's great hue and cry about this piece of legislation, right? Oh, the nanny state, da-da-da-da. What was it? It was political theater. That supervisor, if you're looking for name recognition, you're looking for incumbent advantage, got his name in the paper. A lot.
Now, for good or ill, people are going to forget, but by God, he got name recognition. And so if you have a legislator at the national level, and you have them communicating with their constituents how nice it is to say, I introduced a piece of legislation that is going to do X, Y, or Z, you don't necessarily hear whatever happens to that piece of legislation. But by introducing it, they're seen as a hero, and they're able to rally their constituents behind them. So sometimes a bill is introduced with an eye toward dying in committee. It's a political strategy. Then the committee votes to report on the bill. So there, especially in the House, when you have 435 members, there's no debate going on the House floor. 435 members, it's impossible to have a debate with 435 people. So they really go by the reports from the committees. The committees do the bulk of the work. They investigate the bill, and they report on the bill, and then the House votes based usually on the committee's report or the committee's recommendation. In the Senate, it's a little different. There's only 100. And floor debate is much more prevalent in the Senate than it is in the House. A cultural element of the Senate. It's what they do. So floor activity and debate in the Senate is much more prevalent. It goes into conference committee if necessary to resolve differences. And then, as we know, it goes on to the president to sign or to veto. It becomes a law, it's printed, codified, and goes into regulatory activity that we'll touch on next week. So then the congressional committee hearings, which is, I like to call it pluralism in microcosm. We're looking at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or how the Congress develops U.S. domestic policy. So I'm using the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and a specific funding element just to draw the overall picture of policy development in the United States, in Congress specifically. When I say how a bill becomes a law, that's really just the mechanic. We're talking about policy. We're talking about policy to drive the United States and to drive law that's going to be put into effect. So whether it's health care, Social Security, don't ask, don't tell, making law is just the mechanism by which that policy decision happens. So what you have then is a four-stage process that's further developed down, and it starts with the genesis of public policy. In other words, where does this idea come from? Oftentimes, I have to tell you, it comes from interest groups. We're talking about pluralism. We're talking about pluralist theory. If you're talking about defending the lawyer's right to be evaluated at the local level, if you're talking about putting a cap on malpractice suit, you're talking about interest groups that are the impetus, the genesis for public policy. And so you have the idea, let's say, of public policy. You have the birth of an idea. And then it goes into stage two, which is development of the public policy. And that's where we're at tonight. In the legislative process, you develop the public policy. And I'll give you the structure by which that happens. Next week, we're going to talk about the implementation of public policy when we talk about the president and the bureaucracy. You have feedback on public policy that's going to create a new genesis of public policy. And so what we're looking at then is feedback on the public policy. And what they're doing now is they're going back to the legislative process to see how can we make it work better. And so you have feedback on public policy being the genesis of a new public policy. What you want to do is identify a legislative strategy. To identify the legislative goal, what do you want to achieve? What is it you're trying to get? And who are you? The interest groups, the legislator, the administration, the bureaucracy, the states? You want to identify the goal of the law, the legislative goal. To arrange a strategy for reaching that goal that might include legislation. Maybe you don't need legislation. Maybe you just need bureaucratic regulation to achieve your goal. Maybe you just need to fix the website. Maybe you don't need a whole new law. Maybe you need to fix the bureaucracy. So the focus on important related legislation then, or how to get legislation to affect your end, to identify the preferences of key legislators. So how do you get key legislators, those people with seniority, those people with the connections, to sign on board with your policy? And then solicit information from constituency groups, from the parties, from the bureaucratic players, from other policymakers, the states, elected officials. Determine the order of actions and the actors to perform them. Establish visible coordinating networks for each effort level. Build coalitions. Direct persuasion, interest group lobbying, electoral activities, and then key on the potential for media support. Get the public behind you. A good legislative strategy, or a strategy to achieve legislation. 6 key elements: agenda setting, deliberation, enactment, implementation, output, and outcome. Policymaking stage 1, the process of making an issue visible enough that political leaders take it seriously. For example, Enron and the contributions of Enron to political committees and to key legislators, and the idea of campaign finance reform. How Enron's political contributions did an end run around legislators' seriousness in forcing Enron to behave correctly. Stage 1, agenda setting. Stage 2, deliberation. That's where we're at, to talk and to discuss and debate over issues placed on the policy agenda. Input at the committee level from politicians, interest groups, the public, media, and policy experts. And so that's my test case tonight with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Enactment. Passage of a law by public officials to enact that law, and it's usually accompanied by no small measure of credit taking from public officials, from elected officials, once a law is passed. Stage 4, go ahead and implement it. Get that piece of legislation into implementation. Get it into action. So translating the legislation, the law, into an actual set of government programs or regulations. Actually getting it implemented. Stage 5, output. Actual provision of services and regulations when it actually happens. So you've taken it from enacting it in the regulatory process, in the bureaucracy, and you're actually creating output. This is where the rubber meets the road, output. But then, outcome. How effective was the output? Did it work well? Did it work the way you wanted it to? Or do you need to retool? Policymaking stage 6, the effects of the policy output on individuals and businesses, and it often gives rise to new issues or to new problems. And then we're back to, as you would imagine, policymaking stage 1. So one of the issues with making domestic policy, so many issues, so little time. Choose your battles. Right? You only have so much calendar time. You only have so much legislative attention. And so creating that agenda is important. Remember, if it rises to the top of the public knowledge, of the public discourse, of the public attention, a la Chapter 6, public opinion, the more likely it is to become legislative agenda. You have to put together a winning coalition. So when you're building your legislative team, you have to get those legislators on board who are actually going to be able to help you. And seeing policy enacted unscathed, going through the regulatory process, going out into the bureaucracies to make sure that what you intended actually gets passed. I gave you the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, who you remember soft-pedaled, that they monitor carbon monoxide emission. And the states had to sue the EPA to force them to do their job. So seeing that the policy is actually enacted as intended and unscathed is another challenge to making domestic policy. So finally, our case study then, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So you heard Mitt Romney say that he was going to do in Big Bird. There was a whole conversation behind that. And this is what's so fascinating. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, you may have heard this term, right? And we're going to talk about it again next week when we introduce the presidency and the Iron Triangles, because this is going to be our test money for that lecture as well. It's a private nonprofit corporation created by Congress in 1967, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. Their mission is to ensure universal access to non-commercial, high-quality content and telecommunications services, and it does this in conjunction with non-commercial educational telecommunications licenses across America. This is off their website. This is their mission statement. The purpose of public service media is to provide programs and services that inform, educate, enlighten, and enrich the public. It's their particular responsibility to encourage the development of content that involves creative risk and that addresses the needs of unserved and underserved audiences, especially children and minorities. So here's Big Bird. Here's Sesame Street. Here's the electric company or whatever you have today. So what is the congressional committee structure that's tasked with creating Big Bird? Or funding Big Bird, let's say. The Subcommittee on Telecommunications and the Internet of the Committee on Energy and Commerce of the House of Representatives. So Big Bird gets his feathers preened from the Committee on Energy and Commerce, of all things, and the Subcommittee of Telecommunications and the Internet. They're the ones who oversee, and by oversee I mean fund, 12% of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. 88% is private donations. So 12% of their funding comes from the federal government. In the United States Senate, the committee that oversees is the Commerce Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, and Internet. So it's the Commerce Committee in the Senate. The subcommittee is Communications, Technology, and the Internet. So if you're looking at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting domestically, a la Big Bird, that's one set of committees. But remember, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is also responsible for the voice outside America, the voice of America, the voice of Asia, Radio Free Cuba. Any radio programs that are intended to spread democracy, the American ideology, beyond its borders, is also included in the mission of the CPB. So the Committee on Foreign Relations in the Senate and the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House both have jurisdiction over non-military U.S. international broadcasting. The Committees on Appropriations of the House and the Senate appropriate funds for the U.S. international broadcasting on an annual basis. So whereas these other committees spend the money, that money's got to come from somewhere, yes? And so it's the Committees on Appropriations from the House and the Senate who are going to raise the revenue to give to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to allow Big Bird to do his thing. So again, agenda setting, as we're going to talk about next week with Lyndon Johnson and the creation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, what were they trying to achieve? Then I'll show you next week, when you look at the funding of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, especially one committee hearing that was intended to approve or disapprove the migration of public broadcasting from analog to digital. You remember that from a few years ago? The change to digital? And how that conversation blew up in their face and created this huge discussion about the role of CPB in the public discourse and whether it had a liberal bias and whether it was fair, whether the religious right was sidelined. It actually culminated in an apology to Traditional Values Group who felt slighted, forcing them to apologize before the subcommittee would approve their appropriation to convert them to digital. Enactment, implementation, output, outcome. Coming back to agenda setting.
So this process is the first leg of a three-leg mechanism known to political scientists as the iron triangle. Now, we'll be talking about the iron triangle next week. Actually, it's going to be your seminar question for your chapter in studies on bureaucracy. But for today, we understand that this is where the iron triangle begins, in congressional committees. So scholars have coined the term iron triangle to describe the form that these tripartite interinstitutional relationships take, recognizing how difficult it is for other parties to break through the barrier, hence the iron triangle term. For many observers, iron triangles can carry a pejorative connotation, one of cozy insider relationships that limit public participation and thus pluralism. They also associate the concept with capture, where these relationships create an environment that generates agency and subcommittee sympathy and often support for the interests of dominant political groups. A more positive view sees fluid competition among interest groups at that point of the triangle, allowing both the agency and subcommittee to benefit from broader perspectives and competing information and arguments. Moreover, as we discussed earlier, two or more committees can exercise jurisdiction over the same policy area, furthering both fragmentation and competition, but also exponentially increasing pluralism. Iron triangles are most likely to form in relatively narrow policy areas that tend to be low in visibility and controversy, and that lack widespread legislative interest. Maritime commerce provides an example of an operating iron triangle. At one point of the triangle lie the 5 commissioners and key staff members of the Federal Maritime Commission, which regulates ocean-going commerce and subsidizes shipbuilding. At another point lie the members and staff assistants of the
House Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, and, of course, its Senate counterpart. At the remaining point lie the organized interests that have a stake in maritime policy, including carriers, the vessel owners and operators, shippers whose materials and commodities the ships carry. What about shipbuilders and container manufacturers and leasing authorities and maritime unions? Representatives of the consuming public are virtually absent in this triangular pattern of communication and network. So we've said that public policy agendas really respond to perceived problems. There is no need for action if members of the public and policymakers find the way things are to be acceptable. Additionally, for problems to become the objects of policies that are included within public policy agendas, policymakers must first assess them to be problems meriting authoritative governmental action. As I've said, not all problems warrant government redress. Our classic liberal inheritance demands that supporters of governmental action provide grounds that justify governmental responses to perceived problems. They must first argue that conditions have become problematic, giving reasons why they believe that to be the case. Formulating the nature of the problem can be tricky. Faced with the same conditions, different individuals and organized interests can define the problem differently. Yea, pluralism. They then can use that problem definition as a strategic resource to advance their political ends.
We can't forget in how a bill becomes a law that it goes to the president. Dwight Eisenhower said, "I am a part of the legislative process." Next week I'll be introducing the president as the chief legislator. That his role in signing a piece of legislation gives him special place or a special element in the legislative process.
Presidential involvement in legislative affairs rests with practice and precedent set by presidents who worked vigorously to extend their influence over national policymaking. The list of so-called activist presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson is also a list of our presidents who labored to dominate the legislative process in order to realize their ambitious national programs. The very labels that came to be identified with these presidents, such as FDR's New Deal, Kennedy's New Frontier, Johnson's Great Society, all embodied ambitious legislative agendas. Ambitious presidents do not, however, provide the only explanation for the president's expanded role in legislative matters. This pattern also stems from concerted efforts by Congress to delegate some of its authority by statute to the president and other executive officials, efforts that predate the 20th century. Several factors have encouraged this willing transfer of power by Congress. First, until this century, Congress typically held sessions for only a few months of the year. Congress thus found it necessary to delegate certain of its powers to the executive to ensure the smooth functioning of government programs when it was not in session. Second, the need for flexibility in the timing of legislative policy has often resulted in delegation. For example, Congress voted to renew commercial restrictions against France in 1799, but gave the president the option of ending them if he shall deem it expedient and consistent with the interest of the United States. Third, delegation of power to the president occurred as a result of the long tradition of presidents acting as channels for communication with foreign nations. For example, an 1822 law barred British West India ports from shipping to the United States unless the president received information that American ships could enter British ports. Fourth, the president has long been considered the single representative of the American people. We'll touch on this next week when we address the president as chief citizen. As a consequence, many powers have been delegated to the executive by Congress in an attempt to avoid political fragmentation and controversy that often attend congressional decision-making. This was seen, for example, in several attempts to delegate tariff powers to the executive early in the 20th century. Fifth, executive responsibility to engage in fact-finding and coordination has also encouraged delegation. This is seen especially in the area of intervention in the economy, where measures designed to stimulate and otherwise direct the economy are directly dependent on the quality and timeliness of the information available. Since the executive gathers and generates much of this information, it is often proved to be the logical source of timely action, creating the president as chief economist, which again we will touch on next week. For example, the Federal Pay Comparability Act of 1970 was enacted to ensure that federal pay levels remained roughly comparable with those of similar jobs in the private sector. Such assessments depended on data supplied by several federal bureaus. Based on the data, the President made appropriate recommendations to Congress, although presidents have generally recommended pay levels for federal employees substantially below those of comparable jobs in the private sector. Finally, national emergencies have been an important basis for Congress delegating power to the President. During times of war and economic crisis, the desire for speed and flexibility, respect for presidential expertise, and the innate tendency to seek answers from a benevolent national father figure all contribute to a congressional willingness to give broad powers to the President.
So again, to recap, we have our structural characteristics, those things that are not in the Constitution. They include styles of leadership, leadership structure, party caucuses, seniority, committees, unique procedures, incumbent advantage, compensation, reapportionment, and the legislative process in and of itself. We remember to recap the institutional characteristics, terms, qualifications, constituencies, enumerated powers, institutional leadership, privileges and immunities, revenue bills, confirmation of appointments, impeachment, ratification of treaties.
And here they are in one fell swoop, side by side. My goodness, nearly 3 hours of lecture. You kind, gentle people, I don't know how you put up with me, but you should have enough grist for the mill for your essay. You know, I got to tell you, Congress is a big bag of weird. It's very convoluted. It's very anarchic in a lot of ways in which it operates. And 3 times, Congress itself has tried to reform its processes. There were 3 efforts in 1945, in 1965, and again in 1992, were ambitious efforts to modernize the legislature, making Congress more efficient and more transparent. Well, although they were created in different periods, they share many similarities, such as their goals and the aspects of Congress they recommend reforming. Perhaps the single most important common theme that runs throughout the history of the 20th century Joint Committee reform efforts is that changing the institution is, not at all surprisingly, very difficult. If change were easy and the solutions were simple, we would not expect Congress to have to resort to unusual, infrequently created committees that produce sprawling plans for the legislature to consider and then revisit the same topic again and again and again. And the fact that Congress, when it recognizes the need for change, is sluggish in adopting recommendations or accepts more modest goals than reformers propose, further testifies to the difficulty of institutional change. At the same time, the fact that later Congresses have, sooner or later, instituted joint committees reforms shows that they are invaluable tools for generating ideas and legislation. One can only wonder how the legislature would fare if members were quicker and bolder in implementing the suggestions these committees generated. Should future joint committees desire to be more successful in implementing their recommendations or passing legislation, they will have to pay particular attention to how they can overcome inherent institutional resistance to the changes they suggest. For your seminar question, which we introduced at the beginning of this lecture, seems so long ago, how do the institutional and structural characteristics of Congress support or impede the pluralist ideal? Now, creating a thesis statement out of a seminar question is old hat to you by now. You can do this, I'm sure, far better than I. But if I were to take a stab at it, I would say the institutional and structural characteristics of Congress both support and impede the pluralist ideal. And so if I were to have an outline resulting from this thesis statement, I would suggest that your introduction, paragraph 1, including your thesis statement, paragraph 2 is, what is Congress? Remember, your reader knows nothing. What is Congress? Paragraph 3, what is the pluralist ideal? You want to start at the higher level and work your way down. Paragraph 4, What are the institutional characteristics? Paragraph 5. What are the structural characteristics? Paragraph 6. How do they support the pluralist ideal? Paragraph 7. How do they impede the pluralist ideal? Paragraph 8, coming in at about 2.5 to 3 pages. Conclusion, reiterating your thesis statement. Now, this is a lot of material, Mike. So what do you mean getting all this into one paragraph? Well, 1 or 2 paragraphs. What the idea would be is to provide a list, not a laundry list, not just a long, boring read, but give me an idea of what the structural characteristics are globally. And then that may be one paragraph. Another paragraph, if you wanted to stretch it a little bit, is to pick one of the structural characteristics or pick one of the institutional and really dive in, drill down, and get into the weeds of how it impedes or how it supports. Okay? So how you do your essay is up to you. I can give you some ideas, but what I want to see is the fullness of what the question is asking. Okay? So you should have to, as I mentioned, edit. This is a huge question. I can't tell you the number of books that I had to pull off my shelf for my bibliography and my citations to give you the information in a 3-hour recorded lecture. So I get it. It's a lot of information. Give me your best shot. I can work with you. If you have any questions, call me, text me, whatever the case may be. But I look forward to reading your essays. As you know, next week we touch on the presidency and bureaucracy, and that is going to be an interesting lecture. So I look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Take care. This is Mike Corrali with the Introduction to United States Government course online. Goodbye.